Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming here on our second day of the workshop. This is connected to yesterday's workshop, but however, the funder is different. Today's is a British Academy funded workshop, and it's basically connected to Professor Sanjay Srivastava's visit here. He's here visiting King's College London as a visiting fellow, which has been awarded by British Academy. And part of his work here for 3 months over summer is to also bring together a number of people working on this theme of today, that is big data, urban governance in the margins of the city. So part of it today is about bringing everyone together, but also we want to hear from you and thoughts and different ideas. So the structure is that Sanjay will start talking a bit about his work here in these 3 months that he's been here as a visiting fellow with the British Academy. And then just following on immediately from that, we are going to have Rito Jyoti Bandapadhyay, who is going to talk about the history of big data. And then immediately afterwards, we'll have Ursula Rao. The other thing probably I should mention is in our session 2, just after the coffee break, we will also have the British Academy Policy Advisor visiting us. I'm assured this is in no way a surveillance to see what he's doing, but he just wants to know the exciting work that has been produced as part of this British Academy Fellowship. So no pressure to the people who are presenting in session 2, but there will be presence from British Academy here as well. So just to kind of introduce Sanjay. Sanjay and I obviously have been working in the ESRC project, which you heard about yesterday, and his visiting fellowship here for these 3 months was also affiliated with King's Geography and with myself. And he's been working already for some time in Sonia Vihar. I think he's going to talk about that today. But particularly in the notion of what big data means if you see it from the margins. And Sanjay is, obviously, for those of you who don't know, he's a very well-known, reputable social scientist from India. He's a prolific writer, several books, several articles, and he also writes in the public media. He's written several media articles with very well-known journals and public outlets. So he really needs no introduction. He's also an anthropologist by training, teaching in sociology, and now visiting fellow in geography. So thank you very much, Sanjay.
Great, thank you. Thanks once again for turning up this morning. As Iona said, what I would like to do is think about, and earlier in the morning I heard Ursula talking about what do social scientists, anthropologists do when they're looking at things like big data, satellite mapping, and someone yesterday was a question about what happens to those minor technologies, not so much kind of ARC, the GIS technologies, but little technologies that are part of interstitial spaces. And that's what this is about. It builds upon the discussion yesterday, and also try to think about what are the largest, because we did talk quite a bit yesterday about different kinds of contexts, social context, political context, cultural context, economic context, upon which technologies operate. And that's what I would like to do today, but through a very specific example, which is part of my British Academy work, but also something that methodologically I would, I'll apply to the ESRC work that we are all, that 4 or 5 of us, 6 of us are a part of here. So let me just begin. I'll read from a newsletter by ESRI, the large corporation, which of course, as you know, runs ARC GIS, which is one of the largest, I think the largest GIS provider, software provider in the world. So this is from recent newsletter, and then I'll go on to my other work. So this is an image from the newsletter. Okay. So it says we are now entering a period in which geospatial and other data about cities is growing enormously. This data is increasingly being directed to address the growing challenges facing cities today. Managers and policy people are searching for approaches that better leverage this digital data to improve decision-making and government management. Finally, there is a strong interest in making government data openly available to the public and businesses in the belief that this can stimulate innovation and provide more government transparency. As a result, it goes on to say, GIS is being more widely recognized as a powerful platform for local governments to achieve these goals. its ability to manage, integrate, analyze, and visualize very large and complex data is making it an essential platform for creating the sustainable city, for creating sustainable cities of the future. And in just one little bit more, so GIS systems have traditionally been based on database-centric approaches that generate information products such as maps, reports, or views from centralized DBMSs, that is geo databases. While there are some exceptions, such as Geneva, Switzerland, these GISs have largely been implemented as departmental systems, and then it goes on to talk about how the newer versions of data where, while data is being generated, it is already in a centralized form, so you don't have to aggregate it. So that's the newest version anyway. So in general, if you think about big data, geospatial mapping technology, the general idea is, in terms of policymakers, bureaucrats, etc., and of course people who sell them, is that it gets rid, in urban planning, it gets rid of things like clientelist politics, like that it gives you full evidence rather than partial evidence. That is, it is possible to access what's happening at any point in time. And that large samples provide a more deeper and more kind of more deeper picture of what's happening in society. But as we know, I mean, data, as we've been talking about, data are much more complicated than that. And how should anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, human geographers, people who do human geography, not geographers who are human, sorry. But how should they approach this, given that historically our area of work has been different, and we've suddenly landed in the middle of what is this apparent data revolution? So what I want to think about is this kind of, this fuzzy context within which, fuzzy social context within which data exists. The world upon which any technology, and so this is not a new part. I want to think about perhaps some suggestions from me in the sense of what is different about this current form of technology. So that fuzziness that exists, the grounds upon which data actually interacts with people. So my project is, okay, so let me just give you, of course, you know the background of all this is this enormous efflorescence of various kinds of events, smart cities. So this is an event that I went to 3-4 months ago in Delhi, the massive, gigantic event in Pragati Maidan in the middle of Delhi, which is this huge exhibition space, organized by very large companies, corporate houses, very senior bureaucrats were there, some politicians were there. This is so various presentations by data management companies, government bureaucrats that deal with data, government civil bureaucrats, etc., etc. And there were all kinds of presentations and discussions about how data will help us, and all kinds of graphs and tables and pie charts, which I really I was personally quite confused about, and I'm just as convinced that people who were presenting it had no idea what they were talking about. Because they were clearly written by someone else, and they were utterly clueless. So people would say things like, we will put 5,000 neurosensors all around Delhi, but they didn't know why or what it actually meant. So it was written by someone. So I didn't come away feeling all that bad, because I don't think they had any idea as to what it actually means. Okay. And there were solutions. There were companies which provided so-called smart city solutions at this particular event. So this project, my project, is about a place called Sonia Vihar, which is in the northeast Delhi. So that little triangle, is where Sonia Vihar. It's what's known as in India as an unauthorized locality, colony, right? It's at about 700,000-800,000 people, it's a locality which an unauthorized locality is one of 6 or 7 different kinds of settlements in Delhi. It simply means a locality which was never planned to be a residential locality. So it's usually an agricultural land, and people who own that land have leased it out rented out, or sold it to people. So the larger context, of course, many of the issues we talked about yesterday: smart cities, things like so as you're walking. Sorry, I'll just. Smart cities, there's a 2014 Vendors Act where vendors are supposed to be biometrically tracked now. You have supposed to have proper vending cards. People wear different things so that cities become livable, smarter, to the application of technology, and people are, as it were, automatically transformed through technology. And so it's part of the larger trend across cities. And we had a discussion yesterday about various things, and including smart cities. So there are smart classrooms in Delhi, in government schools. There's a smart city plan, of course. The surveillance systems. Delhi has thousands and thousands and thousands of CCTV cameras. If you go into the one particular office of Delhi government, you can see it has a map of where these cameras are, but you can't see very much because, of course, the majority of the cameras are not functioning. So it's the larger context is this efflorescence, this belief, this the idea of the techno-sanguine discourse that technology will solve certain problems because you take politics out of it. So my project is about this place called Sonia Vihar. It's an unauthorized locality, colony if you like. And Sonia Vihar is on the in northeast Delhi on the banks of the Yamuna River. And as you walk to Sonia Vihar, because it's quicker because there's such a traffic jam, you can, from a particular point, you get off your car or whatever and walk. There are water views. That's the river Yamuna, with which is extraordinarily polluted. So that's actually industrial foam. So it's not surf, by the way. So anyway, and you walk to Sonia Vihar. So my project is about this particular lane. Right? Just one lane because I'm an anthropologist. I was trying to think about how does one think about big data, ideas of but big data, but also GIS mapping. But begin with the locality. It's really about one particular lane. This is lane number 2 in G block in Sonia Vihar, which is on the northeast side of, northeast Delhi on the banks of the Yamuna. So as I said, the unauthorized colony is one of the 7 types of unplanned settlements in Delhi. Agricultural land, which has been sold bit by bit by the local zamindars, the landlords, who are the older populations of Delhi, and I'll talk about that as well. In terms of, as an anthropologist working in India, if you don't mention caste, like people get very upset. But so I will, but it's irrelevant here. That's here. So I'll talk about caste here in terms of thinking about technology. Now, so let me just give you the background. This is lane number 2 in G block. The story of this particular lane is that episodically, every government in different parts of India, and particularly in Delhi, puts out a notification saying that we are going to, as they say, the term is regularize this particular area, right? Make it legal. And that if you want it to be legalized, the Resident Welfare Association of that particular locality has to submit a map. So they employ a local draftsperson. You submit a map, and it will then be submitted to the Urban Development Department of Delhi government. And the Delhi government has established its own, it's called Geospatial Delhi Limited. It's its own mapping department, satellite mapping department. So, and then that department is then asked to check this map submitted by the local people through its own satellite maps and ask whether the two map on, and it's whether the map submitted by the people is actually accurate, and can that area then, are the borders correct, should it then be legalized, etc., etc. So the other thing I want to implicitly suggest here is, where do we do field work? What are the kind of places that we do field work when we're looking at these very large macro processes? So my field work has been among civil bureaucracies, in the offices of the Geospatial Delhi Limited, in this locality, amongst the migrants who've come into this area and bought land, among the older landlords who've sold land, for example, among politicians. So I think that's the other thing we will have to, in this project, think about what are the specific sites, where do we actually do field work. Okay. So the legalization processes in Delhi, or regularization process in Delhi, has had different phases. So before 1994, the unauthorized, regularizing the so-called unauthorized colony was the job of the Municipal Corporation of Delhi, MCD. It was then transferred to the urban, what is it called? Urban, I forget the full form, but the urban shelter, there's a department for urban shelter, they now do the regularization. And then the High Court gives direction saying that this has to be legalized. Then the Delhi government will issue these notifications saying, you submit your maps. The maps then will have to be submitted to the Delhi geospatial, etc. So I'll just give you some vignettes and give you some further background and end with some questions. Okay. So I was speaking to a person at GSDL, Geospatial Delhi Limited, and I was asking how it was done, because I was looking at how the maps actually made. He said, we buy satellite imagery every 6 months from the National Remote Sensing Center, which is the government body. It is bought through the Delhi government's IT department. We have the layers for 2014 and 15, but not yet for 2016. This NRSA, National Remote Sensing Center, he says, doesn't actually have any satellites of its own, but buys material from a US company that takes satellites images of Delhi. So you have the very local maps that are submitted, Delhi government, Geospatial Delhi Limited, National Remote Sensing Authority, and then American satellites. So taking pictures of on different parts. Okay, and okay. So the process is then again just to reiterate: RW Resident Welfare Association map, urban development, government, Geospatial Delhi Limited, and then the process of verifying whether it is what it is, right? So between the raw map submitted by the RWA to the Urban Development Department and the satellite map prepared by GSDL, Geospatial Delhi Limited, I think lies a complex social domain that has much to tell us about the role of the state, technological imaginations of the city, and everyday contestations born out of life at the margins of the cities in countries like India and indeed many other similar countries. And this appeared to me to be like an interesting field of investigation regarding ideas of transparent governance through big data, geospatial mapping on the one hand, and local notions of community and claims to the city on the other. In Sonia Vihar, the maps that are produced by GSDL, the second level map, which is supposed to verify the local level map, are frequently disputed by residents who claim that the government seeks to deny their claims to the city through rejecting and redrawing maps produced by the RWAs. Satellite mapping does not account for the wide range of stakeholders whose actions produce the everyday politics of urban space. These include local landlords and migrant workers who purchase land from them in these colonies, land mafias, local politicians, consultants and technology companies, global consultants and global technology companies, and local real estate interests and markets. This is an important focus of my particular research, and it's also something that I'd like to think about as to how to operationalize it in the other project we are all a part of. Now, lane number 2 is a disputed lane. Why? Because the residents of G Block submitted a map, and the GSDL then had its own satellite map, and Sonia Vihar itself lies on the borders of Delhi and Uttar Pradesh, the two states. This is a disputed lane, because in the local map, it is shown as part of Delhi. In the larger GSDL map, it is shown as part of the state of Uttar Pradesh. So now the local RWA has been saying to the Delhi government, look, this is part of Delhi, so you need to bitumenize it, tar it, give us formal electricity and formal water connection. But Delhi government says, look, this has nothing to do with us. It's part of Uttar Pradesh. Okay? So you have to approach the government of Uttar Pradesh. So in fact, what has happened is that they have this, just on the, to the right of this lane is apparently Uttar Pradesh. This lane falls, this lane, to the left of the lane rather, is Delhi. This lane is the Delhi GSDL map says falls Uttar Pradesh. So I thought I would begin with this in order to understand the context in which where technology falls. Okay. Where technology falls normally is in these kinds of contexts. So DLF is in Gurgaon, the brand new city where there's a private metro which is owned by India's and I think one of the world's largest real estate companies. DLF, of course, if you follow cricket, sponsored the Indian Premier League 2020. Where technology normally falls, and how we imagine technology in terms of smart cities to operate in these kinds of contexts. And in terms of what I guess you could call a particular kind of smart protest. So this is a cyclist group in Gurgaon, so leisure and politics coming together in a particular kind of political formation. So the cyclist group is called, I think, called Spill Life, but I think maybe it's a global organization. So many of them are part of different kind of protests. So normally when we think about technology, we think of these kinds of contexts. Normally we think of smart cities. We also think about certain kinds of citizens who protest in a particular manner, who have particular kind of lifestyles. What happens then when technology operates in other kinds of contexts is what I'm interested in. Okay, so this is the map that is submitted by the RWA, right? So you get a local draftsperson, and there's a huge, it's like stretches from there to there. And they submit it, okay? It is here symbolically, but literally overlaid by the satellite map. So that's the one on top, which they were showing me, is the map the Delhi government, the geospatial has produced, and the two don't match because this particular lane, they say, is not our responsibility. So what is the larger politics? How do we think about it? How much time have we got, Iona?
We've got about 13 minutes.
Okay, good. Okay, all right. So my own task is to use this case study as an entry into exploring relationship between discourses of technocratic planning and actually existing conditions that illuminate the politics of everyday life at the margins of the city. Because, I mean, in cities like Delhi and many such similar cities, about 40% of the population, if not more, lives in unauthorized localities, right? And so how do we think about these contexts? So let me just I'll just provide some brief gloss into this kind of dispute. So when a new area is to be settled illegally, the most important thing that happens is the process of securing legitimacy. How do you, present yourself legitimate? The first step that happens is the formation of a Residents' Welfare Association. Normally, RWA, Resident Welfare Associations in India and other such countries, are seen to be part of civil society, right? If you follow the civil society, political society binary that Partha Chatterjee suggested, that's civil society. But of course, the other thing I would like to think about is theoretically, how do we problematize some of the framework that have come to us through ethnographic material. And here, the civil-political binary completely breaks down. Political society for Partha Chatterjee is that realm where poor people who don't have access to the mechanisms of the civil use political connections, so the MLA and MP, informal means. But here what happens is that one of the first things that you do is to form an RWA, because you represent yourself as a part of the formal world of legality, etc., etc. What had happened was that initially when Sonia Vihar was being settled, Sonia Vihar, of course, is named after Sonia Gandhi, right? So there were about 5 or 6 RWAs because no particular group in that locality wanted to be left out of the process of formalization. So there were 5 or 6 RWAs, and then they all submitted maps to the Delhi government. Eventually, it was whittled down to just 2 RWAs, and then eventually they were both registered. They were both given numbers, although the registration numbers, although they were part of the same locality. Eventually, then one of them withdrew, and only one map was submitted to the government for regularization. So at some point, and I'm still trying to figure out which point, the map, this lane number 2 was shown as part of the map, and at some point it disappears. So no one really knows why. But I'm not so much interested in that, but I'm really interested in the wider politics of what people think about what is happening. Okay. And these are various boundaries and people complaining. So this is the UP-Uttar Pradesh border. As you say, it says, thank you for please visit again, etc. So Sonia Vihar is on that border. The state is, this is the map of the state, the GIS, the satellite map. And these are people saying, look, this is where the lane is. It was here. What happened to our lane, right? How come it's disappeared? Okay. So multiple RWA submitted maps. Eventually, only one map is submitted, and from that map now, lane 2 is not there. Okay. So part of my very kind of non-smart city problem, I didn't number my pages, right? So, okay, sorry. So the different things have happened, which will perhaps just try and make sense of the context of what is happening here. So you have the notion of legitimacy, so multiple RWAs. That's one context we need to remember whenever you're working with the so-called informal city. As Sonia Vihar is located in the floodplains of the Yamuna, it was initially overseen by the Flood Controls Department. But as land became valuable in that area, it got taken over by something called the Delhi State Infrastructure Industrial Development Corporation. So that land has become really valuable. So it's not very clear that even a government department wants to see it as a residential locality because it's now could be valuable as industrial land. Then you have people saying in the locality, the other thing is that many migrants who've come in say that actually, there's a caste problem here because the local zamindars or the landlords who own the land do not want the land, our land to be made permanent, improved, because if infrastructure improves in this area, these landlords are the ones who are the real estate dealers. So right now, because infrastructure is very poor, people buy land and sell, and there's a really active land market. So their thing is that, look, we are migrants, we belong to a different caste. The dominant caste in that area are the Gujars, who are the old landowning caste. So their local migrants say that what has happened is that the older landlords do not want this area, the infrastructure to be made proper, because then the land market will die. People will not keep moving in and out. So there's a strong, interesting manner in which technology here, apparent transparency technology has to deal with the local sort of caste formations. Then the other thing is they're saying that what has happened is that the technologists themselves who make these, who do the satellite mapping have been bribed by the local landlords, right? So the technology itself has been gotten too. So there's an entire politics here of perceptions of migrant labor, the relationship with the dominant caste. You have, and of course, a very active land market, real estate mafias, the government body, a government body which itself may not want that area to become permanent because it's more valuable as industrial land, which could be used for some other purpose, etc., etc. Okay, so let me I'll give you, just end with some, if I can find the, okay. So how do we how do we understand these ideas? What is the gloss that I can put it? So apparently you have a GSDL, a technological map provided by American Satellites, whose key supporters are the land mafia and the local landlords, because the map shows that this lane is not in UP. And according to the migrants, the land mafia, local landlords do not want that map to show that the lane is in Delhi because the infrastructure is improved. So ironically, you have this GSDL map whose key supporters are the land mafias and the informal sector. And the People's Map, on the other hand, has the support of resident welfare associations, the civil bureaucracy, and the politicians, who all say, look, yes, the map, that lane is actually a part of it. Let's do it. Let's just improve, bitumenize it. But then the GSDL comes back and says, no, actually, it's not a part of Delhi. So at some point, there's a relationship in civil bureaucracy and the technological bureaucracy. The civil cannot overrule the notions of technology, even though everyone says, look, the simplest thing would be to just make it formal, make it a part of Delhi. There are perceptions of an easily corruptible technology, corruptible both in a literal sense, but also because it does not grant the people a decent living, as far as the people who are living in that area. Land and land maps are a very significant aspect of building a favorable constituency of voters. So there are MPs involved, there are politicians, different kinds of politicians involved. The Communist Party of India has made its representations. Arito mentioned the Maoists yesterday. I thought I'll bring in the communists today. So different kinds of political interests. RWA try and pit one politician against another to get through to an unresponsive bureaucracy. A civil bureaucracy, the Urban Development Department, that though hierarchically superior to the technical bureaucracy, the GSDL, cannot overrule the dictates of technology, irrespective of what politicians might want. Everyone knows that the area requires desperate improvement, but in the maze of files there are and their notings, no one is over to overwrite this sentence. However, this area has not been covered under the GSDL map, which is a frequent kind of sentence. How then do we think of the discourse of technology and its relationship to state, governance, and governmentality? How can we theorize the idea of neoliberalism, which is not my favorite term, and maybe you can discuss it, via the murk within which data actually exists? My own sense is not to too quickly theorize this context as another instance of neoliberal urbanism. For this somewhat functionalist way of thinking about it, by which I mean explaining many effects through one cause, this becomes very functionalist. Rather, I think we need to think about the largely opaque relationship that exists between the various players I mentioned above: technocrats, bureaucracies, politicians, migrants in the city, local landlords, and informal land markets and their participants. It seems to me that an understanding relationship between all of these is too much of a load to put upon a term such as neoliberalism. And this is what I think I would like to explore. So does technology, my question is then, does technology allow certain forms of disputations? So I'm not a pessimist or techno-hostile person, whatever. So my question would be, does technology, in this case, allow certain forms of disputations that earlier forms of maps and surveys, because of the inaccessibility, just did not allow for, because you just couldn't access them, you didn't know where they were stored. You didn't know how to comment on it. So one aspect of this are the local people saying, being able to access the urban development website and say, look, this old map says this lane was here. And this is why it's been excluded. But that has to do with the local politics. So does it allow that? Perhaps it does. And finally then, where does the imagery provided by the US satellites fit into the Delhi landscape? Perhaps by making opaque the actual conditions and the politics of bare life at the margins of the city. And I will end with that, and since yesterday's presentation in China, and since India and China often put forward as the two kind of really significant contexts for urban development, I'll end with one of my favorite slides in terms of think about the complexity of the context that all of us work in when thinking about technology, which is this slide, and I'll end there. Thank you very much. It's from a restaurant in Delhi, so. And this is a British Academy Fellowship. I'm sorry the gentleman is not here, so you could see that. So, Chinese goods in India are now related as very cheap goods, right? There are these Chinese shops you can buy really kind of like a two-pound shop. There's a restaurant in West Delhi which says, eat Indian, feel British, pay Chinese. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Perfectly on time.
Okay, so in this presentation, I'll try to do a couple of things. I will first give you a sense of the larger project of which this presentation is a part, and I've just started it. Huh? No, not my computer. So this is just a starting thing. And I then trace the genealogy of the contemporary big data phenomenon in the Cold War and early post-colonial era. The project follows the anticipation of the big data phenomenon in the three interconnected developments in the mid-20th century, i.e. the emergence of algorithm as the science of computation, the birth of the idea of an integrated national economy as a central object of the post-colonial governmentality, and the triggering of Cold War big science initiatives that require data management at a cosmic scale. The project identifies the Indian Statistical Institute, in short ISI, in Calcutta, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics in Pune, and the Planning Commission in Delhi in the 1950s as sites where these three developments interfaced in 1950s. Taking the year 1951 as the key moment in the history of data in India, because that was the year when National Sample Survey started its journey. The project further shows how the ISI emerged as a significant player in the science of government. It then seeks to understand the kind of relation this history might have over the contemporary phenomenon of data centers, a key site without which the contemporary arrival and valuation of big data appears unimaginable. Contemporary data centers provide the infrastructure both of storage as well as of processing or interoperability, which in turn gives big data its bigness. This interoperability also allows for a kind of marketization of data, enabling the growing corporate control over data process at the level of the data center, wherein the data center continues to serve as a data exchange organization. The earlier emergence of institutional nodes such as ISI as sites of compilation as well as processing of data thus raises key questions as to how this compilation as a possible precursor to data centers reasons with the processes of governance. What, for instance, were the terms based on which this compilation or processing operated and perhaps created conditions of interoperability? Big data thus appears as the axis of two imperatives: creating an abstracted economy of data itself in the form of social, legal, ethical, institutional, epistemic, and communicative structures and governance that consider data as the fundamental unit of exchange and that of national economy making. What will be the dialectic between these two imperatives? Data centers are giant logistical installations making possible for multiple systems of applications to exchange information and to reciprocally manipulate the already exchanged information. In other words, data centers make data interoperable by ensuring connectivity and usability. Multi-user data centers, in short MUDCs, of contemporary times emerged in the middle of the previous decade as emphasis gradually switched toward subscription and capacity on demand services in the IT industry. The emergence of MUDCs was implicated in some of the key developments in the industry in the last couple of decades, such as the enhancement of data transfer capacities, acceleration in data retrieval, and the ascendancy of technologies such as cloud, etc., and the spectacular increase in the operational capability of delineative processing of data. By the mid-2000s, data centers successfully superseded the earlier era data centers dominated by networks of millions of semi-autonomous computing devices. The mutation of these technologies in data centers has further reduced the turnover time, now to be understood as time taken for the advanced capital value to return to its initial form, recovering its initial amount, which is at the heart of the contemporary information and communication revolution in capital. Interoperability and seamless exchange of data between multiple users through data centers dissolve transport paradigm that revolves primarily around the overcoming of space in favor of a paradigm in which the control and coordination of timing is at the forefront. In high-frequency trading, for instance, more emphasis is paid in shortening the turnover time through low latency within data centers, which makes the geography of data centers important as increase in distance reduces speed. How did all this happen? Were there anticipations of big data in the analog era? A distinct line of anticipation of big data can be attributed to what anthropologist Timothy Mitchell describes as the emergence of new forms of political reason and calculative practice in the mid-20th century that constructed economy as their object and introduced their feature into the government. Attempts at aggregating price levels, wages, consumer spending, money supply, purchasing power, and savings created an effect of the economy which appeared governable and amenable to interpretative manipulations in calculation of the growth rate. As Mitchell argues, in the post-war world, the economy emerged as a new interacting system to bring the future into government. The taming of future and making it available to the present also allows division of a collective world into a series of governable units. The emergence of economy as a new governmental rationality was backed by the proliferation of new organizations such as think tank bodies, economics and statistical centers around the globe, including in the young nation states such as India. Throbbing with quantitative positivism, these organizations would start deploying probabilistic statistical methods and state-of-the-art computing machines at the behest of the organizations such as the IBM to produce public economic knowledge outside the day-to-day contestations of political debate, contributing to the parallel effect of the economy as an object separate from the state that operated as a visible mechanism independent of the process of government. The rise of giant research wings in the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank, along with a host of statistical research bureaus in the post-colonial countries, gave the economy a robust shape with new kinds of data and figures, such as the GDP of nation states and their relationships appearing in and generating public discourses. The second line of anticipation of big data and data centers in the early Cold War context was closely associated with the emergence of what is known in the history as the era of big science, led primarily by US and USSR, predominantly in the fields of nuclear physics, space, earth science, climate science, and oceanography, with a very strong military investment in research and development in premier research centers and universities. In fact, the International Geophysical Year, or IGY 1957-58, can safely be termed as a pre-electronic big data center. Huge cache of data on physical environment were gathered and preserved in World Data Centers, WDCs, with an aim to serve scientific research and military precision. Aronova points out that the IGY anticipated a key feature of today's digital big data practices. I quote, "The notion of centralized storage of open data freely accessible to the users from around the world." It is in the context of the Cold War big science and the world politics that the IGY and the WDCs indulged in an unprecedented circulation of data on physical environment and developed a regime of exchange and secrecy in which data became a form of currency. Data were collected often for the sake of their accumulation without a clear understanding of their use in the immediate future. Thus, a two-pronged development during the early Cold War years, i.e. the birth of the economentality in the field of government and emergence of massive data banks in facilitating big science under continued military presence in the research and development of computer technology drove us to a regime of data that began to produce spectacular amount of data in new fields. However, the most important development in this era took place in the coming into prominence a pervasive exercise to produce what Bock calls data aggregates through charts, tables, maps, or even algorithms to fit individuals into the mass. Thus, the initial years of Cold War era was marked by the zeal to measure everything from natural phenomena to acts of individuals. If the 19th century witnessed an avalanche of printed numbers, Ian Hacking, the interwar period and the Cold War era witnessed the golden age of statistical graphics. Needless to say, aggregations were the basic architecture to legitimize old abstractions such as the nation. The idea of a unified national economy as an object could now be measured due to the avalanche of new data in the forms of new business procedures, banking reports, household returns, and other forms of accounting. What then marks the early Cold War era in the emergence of a new data moment in the two domains of economy and big science, both of which interacted closely with the military-industrial complex. In India, the era was marked by decolonization, emergence of a mass electorate, and the birth of the national economy as an imagined community of producers and consumers. In the post-colonial world, the birth of the economy intensified ambiguities in the accounting of the vast array of unregistered and undocumented economic activities in the shadow of a fledgling fiscal and monetary regime. Okay. In such a condition, data appeared to be the only means to discipline the non-formal aspects of the economy. At the global level, on the other hand, the newly established governing organizations such as the UN and the World Bank began to set protocols and standards to make such disparate databases commensurable and comprehensible. In these decades, the considerations of the national and the developmental would frame the architecture one required to generate a database. In the Indian context, the larger project shows the NSS starting in 1951 did perform this precise task. From 1980s, a role reversal, however, began to take shape as data started determining what would be developmental and what could be called the national. That is the role reversal I want to point out. It is thus argued in Economic Survey 2016-70 amidst demonetization, published every year by Ministry of Finance before the Union budget, that the coordinated operation of the goods and services tax after demonetization of currency would produce the much needed big data in the field of economy, leading to a more accurate unification of the so-called informal economy into the country's GDP. I quote from Economic Survey. It's a very prominent quote, I think. For the first time, the Economic Survey has embraced big data. We mine this data to shed new light on the flow of goods and people within India, which will produce a new sense of national integration, unquote. Demonetization thus appears to be a sincere attempt to unleash primitive accumulation in the petty commodity sector to address the sparse data syndrome in the economy. Conclusion. The NSS related research in descriptive statistics required Indian Statistical Institute to respond to the fledgling economy of computation in the West. The first digital computer in India was installed in ISI. It is called a HEC2M in 1956. Subsequently, in 1959, the Institute, in collaboration with the USSR and the UN, got hold of a large computer known as the URAL. Thus, by 1959-1960, ISI emerged as a national computer laboratory of sort, extending its infrastructural support to Ministry of Defense, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Meteorology Department, etc. In fact, it is more than a matter of coincidence that the early academic enterprise of the ISI and the foundation of the NSS are, to a great extent, guided by the Mahalanobis formula of outlier detection, D-squared statistics, in the dataset that in later years contributed significantly to the development of the GIS technology. The Mahalanobis metric also finds a robust use to handle the requirement of imposed by the data stream scenario of the contemporary era. Thank you very much.
So I have a new project on Bhopal as a smart city, and have is actually saying more than I have. I'm applying for funding for such a project, and I would like to tell you how across two projects, one on spatial injustice in the city and one on e-governance and biometrics, I ended up feeling the need to cast an anthropological lens at the problem of the smart city. So in other words, what is it that I'm achieving with a project of smart cities that might bring together some of the insights I had on kind of spatial injustice and urban governance, combined with kind of new digital affordances and the way they shape space. And the whole thing started a couple of years ago when Seta Lowe at a workshop asked me, so can you give me a paper about how biometric technology and e-governance is impacting the city? And I didn't have an answer. And so I'm set to find an answer in the next 7 years, and I'll tell you today the working hypothesis from which I'm starting. It's about virtual gaps and about rethinking the city in relation to the village. This is the project I initially did in Delhi, and it was during the peak of slum demolishing 2010 when they were preparing for the Commonwealth Games and resettling 1 million slum dwellers at the margins of the city. And I looked at Savragevra, which is a resettlement colony that came up at the margins. And what's happening here is that when I observed the way people were resettled in Delhi, I made a fairly conventional observation. The fairly conventional observation is looking at horizontal space. So most of the global cities are organized in concentric circles where the rich live in the inner city and it gets poorer as you move out. And this map provided by Dupont, who worked on this initially in 2008, shows very clearly how the initial set of resettlement colonies where slums in the inner city were demolished and people resettled outside the city. This is the initial ring created in the 1970s to 80s under Indira Gandhi's emergency rule. And what you see here in the dark triangles are the new resettlement colonies created in the run-ups to the 2010 Commonwealth Games. So I was working here, but I was working with Havana as well, and you see there's Narita, there's kind of lots of these informal colonies coming up just at the border. This is actually an interesting statistical trick. So most of these resettlement colonies were located just outside. So there's the state of Delhi, and within the state there's the city of Delhi. Now there's a very narrow corridor that is village Delhi. And so if you locate these resettlement colonies in village Delhi, then they actually are no longer in the statistics of Delhi. So Delhi's poor population dropped within 10 days, it dropped by 10%. So when it was more than 40%, it suddenly dropped below 30%, which is just a statistical trick accompanied by basically people being forcibly moved outside into village Delhi. They were no longer in the city. So it's a form of spatial injustice, and the work I've done in South Tagore, of course, there's lots of people who have written about Amitabhaviska among them. But what I was interested in is not about the spatial injustice as such, but the way these resettled populations then kind of try to build a new life in the resettlement colony. And what you can see, I will not kind of walk you through the argument, but what you can see here is that within a few years, people who had been resettled in a very unfortunate space outside the main city, without infrastructure, without funds, came up with a proper colony. And what I'm arguing in the article on kind of making the global space is that increasingly these people felt that if they are going to be legitimized in the city and not resettled again in the future, they will have to live in a way that is appropriate for the imagination of the new city. So they were making formal houses, they were making them to specifications. The state was not very engaged, but they managed to do it kind of in self-help, feeling that it's only if they invest in housing will they become legitimate members of the community. Now, this is, so suddenly what happens is that this place, which is at the margins, and you basically drive 10 kilometers through agricultural land before you actually reach this resettlement colony, they were making this urban hub, which at the end has a wall, and kind of this was actually the day we were there, Melissa. I photographed this wall, and they told me behind this wall is Haryana. So this is kind of where Delhi ends. This is we are in Delhi, but making the city at the margins, I realized after some time, has dimensions that are not properly accounted for when you speak in terms of horizontal organization of space. And so there's no solid waste disposal system. There is no water connection. So there's no underground water connection, but there's either municipal water that's being brought in by kind of big tankers, or there are pumps which then are processed by private companies so that people can get clean drinking water for a price. So they have to pay 50 cents per litre. So it's really expensive. And then finally, there is a very good provision of electricity, which predictably in India, in the poor quarters, is switched off for many hours in the day because there's not enough electricity for the whole city. So each of these suburbs get disconnected for certain hours, and the poorer your neighborhood is, the longer the hours you get disconnected. When I was thinking, the other thing is about the mobile phone, right? The mobile phone is, sometimes you get no connection, sometimes you're in Haryana, and so as you move through the colony, you constantly get these SMS, welcome in Haryana, welcome in Delhi, welcome in Haryana, welcome in Delhi, welcome in Haryana. And the problem, of course, is for poor people who move in a territory that's kind of not properly serviced by these telecommunication waves. They have to then pay rooming when they're in the wrong part. So you're constantly kind of looking for the lane in which you can, okay, now I have to telephone to Delhi, and now I have to telephone to Haryana. So you're kind of constantly moving in space in order to account for the signal that you're catching from the top. So that was a time when I was looking for a different way of thinking about space. Space is more three-dimensional, and this is where I, at a seminar, met Stephen Graham, who's written this fantastic book, which I really adore, on the city from satellite to bunker. So he's speaking about vertical space. He's saying, what if we account for space not in terms of kind of the flat space, but in terms of what's up there and what's down there, right? So if we square this to this, then what we have is a three-dimensional imagination of kind of spatial organization. And this made total sense, because then in some senses, this locality was central to Delhi because it was connected through networks and telecommunication to people in Delhi. At the same time, geographically, it was marginal. When, of course, now the metro is being connected to connect the city, then, so there's kind of multiple ways in which it's connected and disconnected. And I was finding that in order to understand what spatial situatedness of paper means in the city, I have to kind of look at this three-dimensional space. And I started looking at topographies in the sense of, I'm calling it topographies for two reasons. One is I was working with, what to geographers, of course, is an ordinary concept of the layered maps. Now, the layered maps has to account, in my case, for several things. I mean, one is because the distance to the city, but also the distance to service centers. And some of these service centers suddenly in digital India might be very close. Then it has to account for political networks that you can mobilize to actually get something done. Because it is a marginal community that is a big community, they could actually lobby for activities or for certain investments in that colony every time before the election. There would be always a politician from Delhi coming to the location and asking, so what do you want? And then they say, we want a school. So they build a school. And so poor people always make sure that they get what they need before the election, because after the election, no one's interested in poor people. But before the elections, they require the votes, right? So if the community is united and it has a strong political representation, then people can demand things. And if they arrive before the elections, then the politician can be sure that these votes will go towards. And this is how Sheila Dixit kind of lobbied these poor places for very long. So it's about political network, it's about digital connectedness, it's about basic infrastructure, and it is about the times of supply. And they are important because when the server is down, when the telecommunication network is not working, when electricity is not there, then all of this might just not help. So it's a topography in the sense of it is in time, it changes in time. Where you are, whether you're central or not, is not a permanent position, but it's in time. And at the same time, it is determined by the layering of these various maps. Are you near to a service center? Are you in a politically strong represented community, and so on and so forth. I kind of stopped working in Savda for a while when I kind of began. Okay. This is taking longer than I thought. Okay, so Aadhaar, biometric technology, was to change all this. And I remember the cartoon where every Indian was supposed to have a cloud. So there was a cartoon where kind of these Indians were, everyone had a little cloud and they were all moving. So, they were moving with that cloud, and so Digital India is supposed to liberate people from these spatial constraints, right? So we've been doing studies with common service centers as one of the new kind of ways in organizing the state, not through kind of the hierarchical layers of the nested scales where there's the state office and then the district office and then the kind of the sub-district office and then maybe the block office and then maybe the village office, and the more central you go, the more things you get done. But now these common service centers, they kind of create a different geography that has to do with, where private entrepreneurs open these centers. And, you see Delhi here, but there's kind of, people living here very close to one of these centers that actually can do quite a lot of, process quite a lot of applications for, state services. And whereas people here kind of are stuck without anything. So while poor people are serviced in new ways, and not even in the village, you can be suddenly very central because you're near one of these digital centers. These digital centers also discriminate against poor people, and this is for several reasons. I mean, this is one of those new Aadhaar-enabled, fingerprinting-enabled Russian shops where you can get your cheap subsidized grains against kind of showing your card and verifying that you are the legitimate card owner with a fingerprint. Now, fingerprints for poor people work really badly. Now, half of the time there's no electricity in the neighborhood. The neighborhood is behind an army camp so that they disrupt the telecommunications signal. You don't get any telephone at all in this neighborhood. So in other words, you're in the middle of the city, but you basically, you're worse off than you are in one of those centers, villages, which are near common service, common center, right? So we have to think geography anew. So that, of course, that kind of, horizontal discrimination continues to exist, but it's overlaid with new forms of discriminations and enabling, which disrupt kind of that geography and layer another geography on top of an older geography. So again, interestingly, when you see that how the private companies then invest in, so which are the locations that actually get selected for kind of new hubs for digital development? These are interesting locations. I worked with a banking company that told me about their decision making. They said, we are going to develop rural India. How do you do it? You do it by bringing the best technology to the most remote place. How do you select the place? The place should be a place where you can make a profit. How can you make a profit? There has to be certain population density. There has to be a certain literacy level. There has to be statistical data available about that location so that you can confirm that there is population density and literacy level. There has to be political stability, and it has to be not in the mountains and near a river and all of that. It has to be accessible terrain. So in other words, there's a differential geography of villages as much as there's a differential geography of cities. And I'm now, which is articulated by these guys by the difference between India and Bharat, right? So they speak about India as the global India, and then suddenly you're in Bharat. This is where you're disconnected, where electricity is not working, where you don't have sewage, where you don't have anything. And it's a little bit like the telephone between Haryana and Delhi. It's not necessarily, usually this is articulated in form of the urban versus the rural India. But what I'm trying to tell you now, this is no longer true in digital India. This is disrupted. This works differently. But it's not random. And in order to understand it, we need to see how this layering works. And so it's rethinking the city and the village in the digital age, which also means that when I've kind of already started rethinking how rural India works through the CSC, I'm now kind of starting this new smart city project in order to see how digital discrimination works in the city, assuming that just by being in the city doesn't mean you have an access to these digital services, but that you might be in a neighborhood where it's just impossible and where you need to move. So what is the kind of labor, and who does the labor of connecting people, and whom, under which circumstances, to which services in the city? And this is what I want to do in this new project.
Thank you. All the three papers were fascinating and a lot of food for thought. But just a quick, what should I say? I'm sorry for the lack of vocabulary. There is a fill in the gap, but I'll proceed with Ursula. I work as a Bhopal campaigner, and I've been working there for past decade. And even before the smart cities were organized, as activists, we were already tracking how the paper proof was now, earlier there was a burden of paper proof on the industrial disaster victims. Yeah. And then as the technology came into the city, they were burdened with the absence or presence of a certain kind of registers where they were either present or they were not present. So the burden was on the survivors to find what those registers are and then to make themselves visible there, right? Now, post the Smart City Declaration, we have been following the Aadhaar impact on the survivors, but also the survivors' jugaad, or you can say the pushback to Aadhaar in the ways they are sort of, maneuvering around it. So that's something that we are already working on. And I think it would be, you should consider the possibility of combining these two approaches. So my PhD was on media and memory of the new social movements in India, where Bhopal was a case study, and I was tracking the transmediality of the urban life. But with Smart City, there is a certain imposition of a new kind of techno-bureaucracy in the city, where there is already, a separate system of bureaucracy around the industrial survivors exist. So there is, let's say, there's a Madhya Pradesh government presence, But there is a whole bureaucracy around the special courts, special rehabilitation, special compensation, different kinds of hospitals only meant for survivors, right? So there are two parallel kinds of systems coexisting. Neither functions very well. And then there is Aadhaar, which connects everybody. And in the earlier reports of Aadhaar, it was already exposed that how Aadhaar is now systematically excluding survivors. So that's something I just wanted to highlight to you. Second is to Professor Sanjay. I'm very curious to see what do you think about the idea of border villages. I'm working in Northeast India now, and the case study of Sonia Vihar, at least in that sort of imaginary when there is a disputed lane, but it also has political value for the government, but also generally for the people. So imagining different kinds of villages around the borders of Northeast, whether it is Arunachal, which has a strategic geopolitical thing, and the government is launching both the things. There is Pasighat, which is coming up as the smart city, but there are also smart village committees formulated. And right now, we don't know how this dynamic of border villages will work out, because when you think of a border, at least in the actual sense of border between China and India or Nepal or whatever, certain amount of agency and certain amount of right to object or right to scrutiny is taken away from people in those contexts. So I'm just wondering that as a researcher, what kind of probably methodological or epistemological ways you think that the two connect, and what could be the way forward? Sorry to everyone for the long.
Is there any others? Okay.
Oh, sure, yes, okay. Thank you so much. I'll make it very quick then. And just quickly picking up on this notion of borders, because there was, certainly two of the pieces where we're dealing with contexts which were physically on a border or ambiguous border perhaps or whatever else. But I was also thinking about the ways in which imagined borders, borders that are constructed within urban space but don't have a defining line on a map or whatever else might interplay with the smart city. So particularly I'm thinking about the area where I work in Saharanpur, where the Muslim mohallas have these sort of border lines which can really be literally a gully which people won't necessarily cross, or the crossing of them have certain implications, or you have to sort of transform your performative self when you cross that line, but there's nothing to demarcate that on a map. It's not it's not a formal border in any way. And how these sort of imagined border spaces interplay with the smart city and create perhaps spaces of smartness which may exist on your side of the border or perhaps across that imagined border.
I have a question to Sanjay and to Ursula. To Sanjay, because you started by kind of raising the question of what is also kind of specifically new about the coming of sort of digital mapping. I mean, you'll be well aware about the kind of volume of work, and now it's actually burgeoning, and that's too much almost on paper and sort of bureaucracy. We'll probably hear more about it today. So one of the things which seems to me is sort of happening in your sort of case is that the sort of chances of contesting maps and sort of kind of locations lies in the fact that a lot of this is actually being translated on paper. So in that sense, the satellite satellite imaging is not the only technology here. Paper itself is a technology, and sort of Matthew Hull's work, etc., and the long history of paper and paper itself kind of opening up to things like property disputes, etc. Paper as it's it's naturally might not be disposed like that, but the affordances that paper itself offers. In that sense, I want to ask you again about the kind of question you yourself raised, that what is sort of new about this? One thing seems to be one thing seems to be about this sort of civil bureaucracy losing out to a techno bureaucracy. But then you're also suggesting that the technological artifact itself is, like, in that sense, an artifact opening up other sorts of contestation. So yeah, so I think that's something I'm trying to kind of point out. To Ursula, it seems regarding these sort of multi-layered sort of geographies of injustices. Now, again, referring back to sort of the work on infrastructure, water specifically in sort of South Asia, Bombay, Matthew Gandhi, etc. I mean, so it seems some of this is, so let's say if you're comparing something like water or electricity to something like telecommunications. So I'm just trying to think if some of this is more sort of democratically contested or, kind of object of democratic politics. Water and electricity seems to be, but and this is of course something to the poor, but also the kind of overuse of spectrum in India. We are all getting call drops in India. We can hardly make a phone call. We can use the internet though. So I just thought if there's a distinction between, let's say, injustices regarding telecommunication geographies and other things like water and electricity.
Thank you. Should we take one last one since Levin raised his hand just in time?
Thanks. Just a quick remark for the first speaker who spoke also about paper maps and electronic maps and how to kind of integrate both. And it reminded me of papers I've seen about the Hong Kong umbrella protest in which protesters were making hand-drawn maps, and Istanbul Gezi Park protest in which you also have these hand-drawn maps. And was just thinking of how to actually draw a map that gives you certain kinds of an agency as opposed to contributing to a map through a range of interfaces. And also brings to the irony of a digital map being quickly outdated, perhaps, as opposed to a hand-drawn map that you can then update as you go. But also the obvious, but I think not less crucial problems of in an authoritarian context, Hong Kong or Turkey, to allow maps to be drawn top-down and digitally, and how paper maps can then provide a different kind of interface.
I'm going to slip in one last question as chair, and this is to Rito, particularly because I was really interested in your big data history, and I was just wondering if I could push you slightly towards thinking through how that big data history then now contributes to or challenges, or what are the tensions between that kind of history of big data that you mapped out with the current big data fetishism, and particularly related to the smart city element. Loads of questions.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry, what? Well, one thing I think when you're thinking about the border question is, both in terms of the actual national borders and other kinds of borders, is to not, just in a broader sense, just in a broader sense, is to not think of the state as a monolith, because quite often one of the things why I said in my presentation that I find the idea of calling this neoliberal development not a particularly helpful thing, because that assumes actually a very old-fashioned dominant ideology model, that the state is a cipher, it has nothing within it, that it simply is in this empty space. One of the things I think we should begin with thinking about borders is never to think of the state as a monolith of any kind, but always an object of ethnography, and then you can think about why these different kind of borders come up. Because if we simply have, quite often it'd be easy to say that this application of technology is another example of this rampant neoliberal urbanism. It actually doesn't explain for us, or rather it's functionist in the sense that it says that you have these thousands of effects, which both Ursula and I were talking about, they can be explained by one cause, right? And so one thing I would say is that, and that a lot of the work has been done, in fact, on borders, those kind of borders as you're talking about that border space as a particular kind of space, as a non-space, for example. William Van Schendel and Malini Shood, for example, have done work on that in the Bangladesh and India border. But any kind of borders, and I think there's also links to Tom's question about internal borders, I think also what's happening with this technology is that it also creates certain kinds of borders. It's able to create certain kind of borders. But the peculiar thing is, and just to link to your question, is that it seems to have what done is a kind of is a strategic essentialism in terms of technology. People will often use it to create certain kind of borders, but also they are also able to then question the creation of those borders, which is I was thinking about what is new, because in many senses a lot of things are not new, right? You've always had maps and surveys and stuff. So what is new about the current? And there has to be something new. It is not possible for the present, to be the same as any other year. Right? That's not, axiomatically, it's not possible, right? So I was thinking about what is new, and one would be, again, so the communalization of a relationship with technology is something that's new. So a lot of people in Sonia Vihar were telling me, as an everyday, they would say to me, earlier, when the government was doing a mapping, it was on a 1 to 1,000 scale. Now they're doing it 1 to 5,000 scale. And they knew exactly what that meant in terms of the granularity, because now it's saying that what the government wants to do is hide detail. So it's now saying it's doing its mapping in 1 to 5,000 scale. So that relationship between technology and politics, while I'm trying to think, I think that is something new that it seems to become much more common knowledge because of a certain relationship with technology. And people are, quite often people will walk into the offices of GSDL, Geospatial Delhi Limited, to question the technology, saying, actually look at the computer screens and why are you making this? And I think that historically in most post-colonial contexts was a complete taboo. You never questioned, and the whole notion of the 5-year plans, the planning mechanisms, the kind of thing Rito was talking about, was a complete unquestioning attitude towards the relationship between modernity and technology. So it's something peculiar that's happening in the sense that both a top-down application perhaps, which many people believe in, but also in some ways kind of a questioning of that sense of what it actually means. Maybe a general, again, I'm not kind of evolutionist in terms of thinking that people are now becoming more aware, but it's something I'm trying to think about because many things are not unusual, right? I mean, we know about these kind of power relationships. And finally, I think what it does, and it's again like a personal thing I'm thinking about, that technology in these contexts, I think collapses that distinction that I think so many of us have been told that's very significant distinction in Brazil and India and Africa, that civil and political distinction that Partha Chatterjee makes, that the civil society is here and political society is here, there's formal is here, informal is here. I think one of the things, the peculiar thing that technology has done, empirically at least for me, is a complete collapse. I don't think ethnographically that's tenable, because as soon as people want to utilize technology for their own purposes, even in these areas, they are automatically have to access formal mechanisms, NGOs, RWAs, technology companies. So theoretically, for me, it seems to me, as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer, that distinction, which is so powerful, it's used in different contexts around the world, doesn't seem to me to work. That there's something called formality and, civil society here and political society. And that is something new. Ironically for me, as someone who's not a techno-determinist, but it seems to me that technology seems to collapse it for that.
Okay. So I thank you for this hint, and I definitely get back to you about that one. I just want to comment on one thing on the border. So as I'm trying to track the kind of the black areas in the city, one is challenged by the perceivability of these borders. And this might be where I see the difference between much more materially kind of present differences in terms of there is water or there's no water, there is a water connection or there's no water connection. In terms of these digital affordances, they drop in and out. And they're at times not perceivable because sometimes it's just because you have this wrong device or because your device doesn't connect. So to trace actually and for these to kind of be open to observation by the senses and then also intelligible to kind of the common understanding of its presence or absence. These digital borders are so much more difficult to account for, which also means to mobilize for or against something becomes much more difficult. But I think it's really important kind of to see the similarities and differences between these different infrastructures and how they kind of intersect.
Anna, I'm just clarifying. Did you ask a question on how do I connect the old data moment with the new data moment, right? See, infrastructurally they are connected. Number two is that even in the big data moment, the old form of census, NSS, would survive. It's not that they will die because you have a new paradigm of data collection, involuntary data collection. Both will continue, but I think by adopting a lot of big data mechanism into census, NSS, etc. So in terms of infrastructure, of course, if you see these connections, ISI, NSS, Mahalanobis matrix, and Mahalanobis matrix being used in data streaming, Mahalanobis matrix being used in a kind of a lot of data analytics right now. I'm saying that it is very important to find the anticipation of the new in the old sort of data. The one thing that I wish to suggest as well was that in earlier times, you had a national goal, you had a developmental goal, and to achieve, you needed data. So data followed events, processes, right? Now, if you look at demonetization, now if you look at GST, etc., it is just the reverse. So you need to achieve a data goal, and for that, you need a social process. So that flip appears to have taken place. So I'm trying to make sense of this very interesting, that appears to me a very interesting shift. Yeah, thank you.
We have time maybe for a couple of last questions before because our coffee is here.
Yeah. Sanjay, I'd like to say that at some level, the question of the geospatial data that was actually collected under the DSSDI program, and I used to work with the Delhi Development Authority at that time, and there was a lot of emphasis and a lot of problems while they were collecting the DSSI data. It's not just geospatial maps; it's also infrastructure lines, complete 3D visualizations of old Delhi, and a lot of other information. But they faced a very real challenge while trying to map what was, say, under Delhi in terms of the underground lines and everything, and then what maps they were producing. So while the geospatial data accessed from the US satellites definitely represents a spatial reality, it in no way represents any legal realities, or for that matter, any on paper, on file realities. And given the fact that the National Land Records Modernization Program, and stemming from that, very recently the World Bank has started putting a lot of emphasis on Delhi's land record management. There's this very distinct issue that the old technology, which I think you were trying to refer to as the paper technology, was basically the chain and the older method of how the colonial powers were mapping the land. And from that, now when you come to the scale of the geospatial and the related other new technologies, you're basically reducing the scale at which the data is being mapped, essentially. And with that, you're automatically changing the buffer of what constitutes as Delhi's boundary and doesn't. And automatically, it's a techno-legal history that has to be traced. It cannot be only legal or only technological, and that will kind of push the question that you're trying to raise about how does then the politics enter this techno-legal narrative, and where does it enter? What's the entry point? Is it the point that where the geospatial data is in itself now the all-encompassing power because it's the visual one? The fact that there is a GSDL gives it the authority to state that we can verify whether this unauthorized colony is in Delhi or not, or is this map accurate or not, or is that enough? I mean, especially given India's legal property regime, which is completely on presumptive title, which completely complicates that entire notion of what is and what isn't.
Great. Any final questions before I hand it over? Sanjay.
Yeah, I mean, I should actually speak to you after. I'm glad you're here. Yeah, see, the border problem is not a complicated problem, surely. I mean, there would be a UP border, Delhi border, that's not a complicated problem, right? You would think that's not a complicated problem, right? States have borders and it's not difficult to determine. But I think the broader question for me is what is created as a problematic here, in the sense that why is it that obviously it's so simple, it should be simple, right? But again, it's precisely this idea of what are the different interests. It's quite possible that on the ground, some people may never want this border to be clarified for whatever reasons. And that is sort of interesting for me, because in any context, at least there would be official maps. This is the okay, India-China borders are disputed somewhat, but nevertheless, each country would say this is our border. But internally, that shouldn't be a problem. So I'm just curious as to, that's why I'm thinking about and those are really interesting points in the sense that precisely that it is not either a techno problem, not only a legal problem, but in fact, I don't think it's only just a techno-legal problem, even that, because even that would be, but so my question really is, what is the problem? I don't even know why this is happening. I just thought it's really simple. But clearly, so that's why I thought I'll just work on this one particular lane, and then it brings together what not so much is what is completely observable, but what do people think is happening? And as much as, but I'd like to really talk to you, because I know that history of the shifts that's happened of different bodies mapping, different, but what are the stakes that different organizations, stakeholders have in constituting something as a problem, seeing something as a border or not seeing something as a border, saying that something good will happen or saying that nothing good has happened because of this. And technology is just really kind of a minor, in some ways. So that's what I was interested in, and because we will have to deal with these kind of issues in our smart cities projects. People saying that this is the easiest thing to do, but all the local interests will come into place. But I'd like to talk to you actually, because that history I'm really interested in. I just got access to these files for some other reasons, but history. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the session.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to be able to talk about my own research to this audience. Just a few words of background, because I think I come from a little bit of a different background than most here. I have a doctorate in PhD in Finnish literature and comparative literature, and I have a docent, which is something like an adjunct professorship in urban studies and planning methods. So I try to combine literary and narrative approaches and in urban studies in my own work. Involved with something called the Association for Literary Urban Studies, which brings together scholars looking at literature and cities. And I'm also one of the editors in a new Palgrave series in literary urban studies. And a recent book that came out that I co-edited with two colleagues is Literary Second Cities, and the introduction of the book has, I think, quite a lot of things that might speak to this audience. And yesterday, and especially people who were here yesterday, talking also about small cities, because we're talking about what is the definition of a second city, and how can we get to that to a different kind of views on city experiences that are not based on alpha cities or these big metropolitan areas. In my current 3-year project, I'm looking at future cities and future narratives of cities at the water. Antwerp, Helsinki, New York City. More can be found on my blog. And I'm happy to answer all questions here or via email. And today I briefly talk about how you could examine city futures in literary urban studies. And so what I do in my own work is to use methods from literary studies such as concepts such as plots, story plots, genre, metaphor, but also I would say methods that are specific for literary urban studies, which try to examine urban, multidimensional, scalar complexity with the help of, for example, fictionalized metaphors, and to see how, if we look at this scalar, multidimensional complexity of a city, and we use metaphors in policy, in planning, in personal narratives, in literary fiction, how that enables us to give a cross-section of that complexity. I'm interested also in how talking about future cities is actually quite akin to talking about fictional cities, because in urban planning, in strategic planning, in future scenarios, if we talk about future cities, we talk about something that is, in a sense, almost fictional. It's not yet knowable, not yet existing, not yet named, and that is why we often come up with metaphors to talk about them. So I think metaphor is a very, can be a really revealing tool to look at the way we talk about future narratives. And my own point of view, and we've heard a lot about narratives and imaginaries, but I think bringing in literary and narrative studies helps us understand the futures and future cities, because these are always couched in narratives with characteristics of fictionality. And metaphor, I would claim here, would be is a condensed version of the broader storylines, and I'll use a few metaphors. So metaphor and future cities, I think at the background of talking about metaphors and cities is the idea that there's always been these metaphors that we have used to talk about cities. This is from a late medieval manuscript, the city as a body, which is an age-old way of looking at cities, but more recent metaphors, the city as a resilient being or a smart city, but also metaphors such as urban cancers that have to be operated upon, or urban problems that have to be weeded out, urban evils. So metaphors are often ways to produce causal or to suggest causal relationship. If a city is congested, then of course you will need cloaca maxima. You will need these kind of bowel functions to work better. If there's a city cancer, then obviously you will have to operate on it. Some parts of the body will have to be discarded, and so you have this very causal relationship that make it very logical to make changes, and often quite radical changes. So metaphorizations are really central to the narrative framing and the problem position in urban and strategic planning. And so my work here draws on broader work in planning as a rhetoric, the narrative turn in planning as persuasive storytelling, which I've written on a bit, and a range of urban planning theorists before me. So metaphor into matter, the title of my presentation. So the idea, one of the ideas at the background of my research is that metaphor and planning narratives more generally, that this is not something that is external to the material city and the processes that shape the material world. It's not that you first have the real city and then you can bring in somebody to have the imaginary city apart from that, but that metaphor and narratives are central to how problems are imagined and then how solutions to those problems are formulated, and they frame and shape the city's material morphology. And then, in turn, that generates new metaphors and enforces particular kind of metaphors of how we envision our action. And of course, metaphors and the way we talk about the future also, they shape a path-dependent agency as well. So within in literary studies, metaphor is something that, amongst other things, is said to be very analogous to fiction. It floats a rival reality. It enables to bring together what I fear seems distant into something close, to recover what is absent, to move from what is to what ought. So a very imaginative operation by juxtaposing something that is with something that could be or should be, in policy quite often with what should be. And if I study metaphor in my own work and in the things I will show here, I think some of the questions that come out are, first, how do specific metaphors draw on larger culture, site-specific or generic storylines? That's a first step I would like to carry out if I do metaphor analysis, to see how does this metaphor, how does it draw on earlier or larger, broader storylines and rhetorics? And then what kind of planning conflicts are framed through metaphor? How are different views, opposing views of the future, how are these framed through narrative and through metaphor? And then how are specific solutions naturalized, legitimized by metaphor? And then what planning conflicts are hidden out of sight by metaphor? Because the metaphors are a way to make something visible that is absent, but on the other hand, by doing so, they make something absent what used to be visible perhaps at the same time. So it's a double operation that is going on there. And I will talk briefly about one specific case that I chose for obvious reasons, because it's one of the few case studies that I'm working with that is also a smart city district. And this is the city district of Calais in Helsinki, which is as you can see, this was from the beginning of the century, a former container harbor. If you notice that this is the city center, so it's located at the sea, very close to the city center. It's just less than a kilometer and a half from the absolute center point of the city. And so it's been redeveloped as quite a typical post-industrial waterfront development with quite a bit of high-rise and nice, quite expensive buildings. Is anybody acquainted with Calais Otama? Anybody heard about it? Is it something that anyway? It's the centerpiece of Finland's smart city policies these days. So redevelopment started somewhere in 2000, will be finished 2035 more or less. It will have 20,000 inhabitants, so you can see that this scale is obviously quite minimal as compared to some of the cities that we've heard about today and yesterday. And so the city district has been defined as smart, a project that began in 2013, and it claims that it is the world's most extensive smart city platform, for what that's worth. And so the idea is that it's a platform for experimenting with smart services, focusing on smart mobility services, effective waste management, reducing food waste, co-creating local services, and so on and so forth. So it's more of a test ground. So this Calais Otama is being built, and at the same time it's a testing ground. Very few people, or almost nobody, live there, and then new people move in, new buildings are created and built. At the same time, services are being tested. Now, I think what interests me is how this metaphor of a smart city feeds into larger rhetorical storylines that are used in connection with this particular area. And one of these things is this area as a place for urban pioneers, as a kind of a new frontier, mimicking frontier rhetoric in American culture narratives and rhetoric that I've also come across in looking at the New York City's waterfront. So this idea that this is something that has not been used, and now new people are moving into this kind of virgin territory, and what was before is this kind of a tabula rasa. It's just an emptiness that you can kind of fill in with whatever you want to. And so this idea of the smart city and these pioneering activities feeds into this idea of urban pioneers moving into a new frontier, but it's actually running completely counter to another storyline of what is part of the city could be, and that is actually the official storyline of the city planning department, which posited that this area, which was marginal or marginalized, that it should be an integral part of the city center because it's so close to the city center, that it would be an extension of this very urban city center, and also would have similar kind of services and similar kind of building morphology as the very central parts of the city. So there's this discrepancy between seeing this as a new frontier kind of tabula rasa and the idea of trying to bring this in the city folds. And behind this idea of a tabula rasa is the reality that there is, of course, all kind of things going on in this everything but virginal territory, a very complex urban morphology of the industrial waterfront with all kinds of services and users and people living and not really living, but at least passing through these areas and using them. And then before it was an industrial port, it was a working class district and a fisherman's district with quite extensive use as well, which of course has become neglected, or this history of the harbor or that part has been neglected by the storyline of a pioneering frontier. And interestingly, this idea of pioneers is something that is actually actively kind of driven at by this Helsinki city in its official leaflets, but it's also something that was picked up by the Huffington Post when they wrote about Calais Otama and about the the smart city part of Calais. So there was a jubilant piece in Huffington Post in which they also mentioned this pioneering. So clearly also within media this was picked up, that this was part of the same storyline, that this is a smart city and there's this pioneering residents as if moving into the American frontier and kind of settling it. And more competing planning narratives, and now I think we come to the most interesting part, which is that the stated aim of Calais Smart City strategy is 1 more hour a day. So the idea is to give every citizen 1 more hour because of these smart technologies, so that you have more time to sit at home and be on Facebook. And I think that this is something that we heard about yesterday, this idea of smart technologies feeding into this efficiency narrative. And where is that leading to? What kind of efficiency? To what aim? And I think that runs counter to a number of other professed aims for the smart city. So the focus is very much on the personal sphere and on efficiency, but behind that is actually when this part of the city became developed, the idea was to build that part of the city as an extension of the city center with a strong sense of urban public sphere, with a vibrant street life, with a functioning public space, with lots of local street level shops. And I believe that is not something that is just nice, but that is this street life, functioning public space is a condition for the city to work, and that was realized very, very much so by the city planners who wrote that into their plans for this particular district. So there was this professed aim to develop Calais as an urban environment, the extension of the city center with corner shops and vibrant public space, which runs counter to that efficiency narrative of enabling somebody to do the shopping really quickly, efficiently, and then do whatever he or she would like to do. Now, I'm building a narrative in which you have this kind of black and white themes of the bleak reality on the ground and the high-minded visions in the planning rhetoric. But of course, the cities are messy. And if you look at all the storylines, there's a kind of a multi-scalar, multi-dimensional mesh of storylines that contradict each other. So some of these smart technologies try to aim at community building and connecting people. So it's not all about just being efficient. There is interesting use of temporary use of brownfield public space in Calais, which also fostered by the city city planning department. So there's all kind of interesting things also moving into that space. But what I think is the most concerning thing in Calais is that behind these competing metaphorizations is basically the hijacking of what had to be the Calais Center. You can see this is the Calais Center is there. And that was in 2007, planned to look like that, and then it was hijacked basically by the semi-public space of a radically inflated shopping mall with much larger towers. And this is, I think, the big story also for how this part of the city will develop. Much bigger than the smart city, that it used to be a plan for very limited shopping mall, something up to 2,000 square meters, with only half of the 2,000 square meters allowed to be in one retail, and that was in the plan of 2007. So with a focus on local shops, and now in a few years' time, in 2013, 2014, they made a new plan which allowed for up to 60,000 square meters. Of one shopping mall, which will be one of the biggest shopping malls in all of Finland, which will be built right on top of the metro, and which will basically squeeze out all possibilities of a vibrant public life on the streets or street corner shops. And how does that relate to the smart city, if at all, and how do the developers who are going to develop this shopping mall, which is called Ready, it sounds like a stupid name in Finnish too. It's going to be developed by private developers, and it used to be called Calais Otama Center with a strong public agenda. Now it's going to be the privately owned already. And what kind of vision for Calais Otama do they have? What kind of agenda for future cities do they have? And fortunately, they had a big symposium which they brought together different people to think about future cities, and as the result, and that was in 2013, as a result, they created a brochure called How Are We Going to Live in 2033? And it actually has professors from the University of Helsinki, and a prominent politician from Helsinki from the Green Party participated in this brochure. So you might say that this is kosher, but the key aim or the key argument that came out was that segregation is good. That was the claim that they made. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but they make the point. Thanks. That basically what they say, that future living needs segregation, exclusion, excluding, differentiation. That's their claim. Because it's nice. Segregation creates recognizability, predictability, security. It's all good. And it's not negative segregation, no. It's positive segregation. And it doesn't come into being, and this is in that leaflet, it doesn't come into being only through the work of inhabitants. It can be supported by public policy choices and urban planning, and that's what they are aiming for, that the public policy and urban planning will support that. Now, what they are claiming is that that basically there's no worries for socioeconomic segregation, but what we have in this post-modern world is we have lifestyle segregation. So one 30-year-old wants to go to the local pub, and the other one wants to go to the opera. It has nothing to do with socioeconomics, just lifestyle preferences. And let's enable these people to not bump into each other, but to hang around with like-minded people. And let's ask politicians to make that possible in this planning. And this is just how they present this. And I think this is actually comes close to what is going on in the smart city. It's not directly connected, but it feeds into the same narrative that actually the smart city district in Calais Otama is dealing with these life preferences. What kind of services to support personal life preferences, and these are blind to socioeconomic factors. So they nicely feeding into each other, and they are, I think, from our perspective, they are quite worrying for how we will be living in Finland in 2033. Now, conclusion one, I think metaphor and metaphor analysis, and more broadly, narrative analysis, and I have to say, I'm the only one in Finland who's picking up these things. Nobody else is writing about them, or it's just so this. It really demands, I think, a narrative scholar to try to pick these apart. There's very few people within urban planning theory who are looking at these, even though it's, I think, pretty much in your face. But so metaphor is a means to examine city planning and imagine city futures. It can unpack rhetorical strategies in planning and bring into focus competing planning visions. But I think metaphor is not only an instrument for critical analysis, but it can be, and this is very implicit, I can't really make the argument in full here, but it can be a tool for planning, because local layers of meaning and local self-narratives tend to be embedded in metaphors, and I think there's a big potential for more conscious inclusion of metaphorizations, of how relationships with space are built personally and communally, to bring that consciously to participatory planning, GIS, and thus moving from quantitative participatory tools and the smart technologies to more qualitative smart technologies. And I think the bottom line is that metaphor moves into matter. Metaphor is integral to framing and shaping the material city. There's a few selected publications. I published a little bit about this already, and more can be found on my blog or if you contact me via email. Thank you so much.
Right, so we've just been talking about literature, literary devices, and of course I have a literary device in my presentation, alliteration, planning, platforms, and participation, 3 concepts, all beginning with P. And let's begin with one of them, which is participation, and specifically public participation, which has long been a kind of contentious issue for various planning and development professionals. And specifically, if we look at the field of urban planning in particular, planners are often worried about how to most effectively engage publics around more technical matters of urban change. And at the same time, urban planners are often accused by others of systematically minimizing participation, sort of convening consultative exercises that are largely about reaching a desired result known in advance. So, unsurprisingly, there's been some keen interest in experimenting with, even making sorts of projections about the possible futures of public participation in urban change, and particularly in relation to or through emergent digital technologies. But what I want to do today is consider what might be seen as maybe one sort of margin of data-driven urban governance, or if it's not a margin, it might be seen as a more ordinary rather than extraordinary dimension of so-called smart urbanism. What I'm interested in today is how existing generic commercial social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter are already creating new forms of participation around urban transformation, even if that's more by default than design. And specifically what I'm interested in is the tensions that might then emerge between the forms of participation that we see through social media platforms and then the kinds of participatory exercises that are designed or maybe desired by planners. Now, my empirical reference for teasing out some of these issues is a collaborative research project I conducted last year with Susan Moore at the UCL Bartlett School and Andrea Ballatore in geography at Birkbeck. And the project takes as its case study the Mini Holland project in the London borough of Waltham Forest. Now, Mini Holland is, by UK standards at least, a quite ambitious cycling scheme. It's funded by Transport for London to the tune of 30 million. It involves a series of significant changes being made to the borough's infrastructure to enhance it for cyclists, but also for pedestrians. And it's proven very controversial, perhaps above all because it creates what are called modal filters. There's one on the top right there, which effectively close off certain local routes to cars while allowing cyclists and pedestrians through. As a program, it's something that's really excited certain kinds of publics, activists, policymakers, residents, who see it as about reclaiming an urban area for cyclists, pedestrians, children. But it's angered others who see it as yet another case of expert rationalities dismissing the needs of ordinary people who just happen to drive, or the businesses that rely on those people driving. Now, the local council was really blindsided by the opposition, so more than 300 people gathered at the town hall when the council was voting on the scheme. Many chanted Labour out. This is a London borough that has been dominated by the party for more than 30 years, where the constituency, the parliamentary constituency for the area, is one of the safest Labour seats in the entire United Kingdom. Here at the official opening of the scheme, protesters directly engaged with a Dutch delegate, who's of course Dutch, being taken on tour of the village, which is one of the most sort of gentrified streets in Walthamstow and sort of a symbolic hub for the project. And here protesters take turns, one by one, haranguing the council cabinet member responsible for the project. Many film the encounter. They later circulate the images on YouTube and connected platforms. And of course, these moving images that were circulated are some of those same ones I'm using here. This case study's interested us because it's more than about merely a cycling scheme. It seems to embody people's hopes and anxieties around a rapidly changing, many would say, gentrifying part of London. And at the risk of oversimplifying into crude binaries, the dividing lines in this controversy seem increasingly familiar today. For example, between the middle class and the working class, between elites and ordinaries, between young and old, between facts and emotion. So in this research, we're trying to understand, or better understand, the ways in which social media platforms have become a kind of backdrop for participation in controversies around urban change. In a very short space of time, in around 10 years or so, social media have become a kind of generalized, pervasive background in urban contexts, like London at least. So in a neighborhood like Walthamstow, platforms such as Facebook and Twitter have just become a kind of ordinary part of getting on locally. Now, I don't really have a lot of time to talk about our research design in detail here. I'd happy to talk about it in the discussion if people are interested in methodological questions. So I hope it suffices just to display this as an overview. But I would say, I guess, that our approach is relatively distinct, I think, or novel in the way that it tries to work between big data and small data forms of analysis. Those are two terms we invoke, of course, with a heavy grain of salt. But what's been central for us is to try and meaningfully move between data analytics methods, so in other words, processing large social media data sets, but then qualitative methods involving closer observation, closer analysis, closer forms of inquiry. But a key issue for us in this project is not just studying how different social media platforms create various ways of experiencing and articulating urban transformation, it's thinking through some of the related conceptual issues. And one chief issue for us here is to think about social media platforms as a kind of emergent communicative infrastructure. And of course this means thinking about the technical qualities of social media, but we're particularly interested in a more phenomenological reading of infrastructure. So we want to ask, under what conditions do social media platforms become sort of a backgrounded, taken for granted way of articulating and experiencing urban transformation? And then, how do we think about the experiential and communicative distinctions that might exist between different social media platforms, different kinds of environments? And here we think it's useful to draw on a rereading of Pierre Bourdieu's concept of field. So thinking of different social media platforms as representing or embodying different fields alerts us to the ways in which platforms might then embody different distributions of rules, resources, and positions for practices or acts of public address. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is explore some of these different distributions through an overview of three prominent digital platforms that, or social media platforms through which publics convened around the Mini Holland scheme. Facebook, Twitter, and a more bespoke platform called Commonplace. And I'll begin with Commonplace, which is a platform more closely tied to formal participation as it's understood by planners. And here it's first worth giving a bit of context. So for borough councillors and staff, the public consultations which led up to the controversy I outlined with those videos earlier had actually been a success. They'd had a much larger than average response rate, 15%, which is large. They'd set up information booths in outdoor public spaces. With local cycling campaign, they'd run these creative workshops. Multicolored Post-it notes had been written, rearranged, discussed. They'd done all the right things. And a key approach, a plank in this approach taken by Waltham Forest Council was to become one of the earliest users of Commonplace, which is a dedicated consultation platform produced by London-based developers. And Commonplace is based fundamentally, as you can see, around a map interface where participants are presented with a geographically delineated area called a commonplace, and they're invited to pin comments to locations. Comments can include not only descriptive entries, but participants can and are invited, really, to add emotional metrics as well. So as comments and emotional metrics accumulate, it creates a kind of heat map of comments color-coded to indicate general feelings about points on a map. Now, what's notable about Commonplace is that it avowedly seeks to be more than just a neutral tool for its clients. So sure, its paying clients do have a privileged access. They get to present the project with information of their choosing. They have access to real-time project dashboard. They're able to easily generate their own infographics from the data they collect, and so on. But using Commonplace also comes with terms and conditions for the paying clients. Perhaps most importantly, these clients have to cede control over the resulting publicly displayed map of user comments. It's also worth pointing out, I guess, that as a company, Commonplace ascribes itself a kind of social mission, much like larger platforms. And I'm sort of simplifying for brevity here, but it's fair to say that its philosophy is one of creative disruption. So it sort of aspires for its platform to be a kind of agent of change, to make planning and other participatory processes more participatory. Now, Commonplace was clearly well used by the council and the participants who contributed to it, but it wasn't really a locus for the sort of acrimony around this Mini Holland program that I described earlier. That was much more prevalent on Twitter and especially Facebook. Now, Twitter is interesting because, as is really well known, I guess, it's so frequently used towards campaigning and network building. A visualization like this one from our research of the mention network of Mini Holland related tweets clearly shows that Twitter is dominated by cycling campaigners and key politicians. So users like WF Cycling, London Cycling, Labourstone, We Support WFMH, PSI Monk, etc. These are all, there's a sort of a mix of politicians, campaigners, and resident groups supportive of the scheme. And even ones that look like they might not fit, for example, E17 Streets for Cars, are not actually so out of place. In fact, E17 Streets for Cars is a parody account. The main group protesting the Mini Holland scheme was called E17 Streets for All. E17 is Walthamstow's London postcode. And that group, the E17 Streets for All, had its own really kind of rudimentary website, and for the most part were active on Facebook using a closed group. And so having this parody account located off Facebook, as it were, really doubly underscores for us how Twitter is a kind of a locus, even a safe space for supporters of the scheme. Worth adding briefly that Twitter's also a locus for just general enthusiasm about Walthamstow, and specifically local change in the area, and this is well captured by the popular hashtag AwesomeStow. This hashtag has evolved in kind of almost like a more general synonym for local enthusiasm, even off the platform, manifesting, for example, in various forms of craft production, which I'm sure you could find if you look on the internet right now. Okay, so turning finally to Facebook. Here we find the platform with the largest user base locally and in general. It's difficult to demonstrate with hard data that this large user base that we see on Facebook actually equates to a larger range of views or contributions around this Mini Holland controversy, but certainly the sheer volume and richness of data on Facebook is greater. So for example, here on the screen you see just one post offering some reflections on a consultative workshop. It generates 248 voluminous comments, and this image tries to show the scale of the information, and I haven't even gone and expanded each comment, so it probably would be longer. But this sort of visualization not only tells us that Facebook has lots of data, but actually, more importantly, it tells us a lot about how Facebook is used around these sorts of urban phenomena. It has a nested thread format, and this encourages a certain kind of contributions that are both recursive but also extensive. And it does so within a larger platform environment, which is highly embedded with and interwoven with people's everyday life and things. And also, of course, their purposeful identity maintenance. This is how people maintain who they are, or arguably anyways. Now, a good example of Facebook's everyday orientation is how exchanges around the Mini Holland project were instigated through what we might call some variety of venting. This is the expression of how one feels at a given moment, and in so doing, the releasing of pressure. And venting is we found venting most often centered around people making these ordinary judgments about local mobility. For example, about bad drivers, inconsiderate cyclists, congestion on the school run. Although Facebook threads very often also drift or even descend into kind of attacks, into insults, with particular contributors being vilified or personified in certain ways. So for example, as the middle-aged white male warrior cyclist, or the middle-class gentrifier, or the internet troll, or the selfish motorist. And one thing to say just on Facebook, though, is it does have a more deliberative side, too. So you see examples of users putting forward more sort of DIY planning ideas, asking for feedback. We often find that these sorts of contributors are the admins of Facebook groups, and these admins very often have served in other capacities locally, like they've been involved in chairing a local neighborhood forum and that sort of thing, and they've sort of crossed over into Facebook as a sort of new a convener of discussions. So this has been a cursory outline, really, of how some of these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Commonplace, interface with and help produce a kind of local controversy. And how we might think about participation via these platforms isn't really straightforward, or I'd like to claim it isn't straightforward, because I think we can't really take for granted what participation is. Nico Carpentier suggests in his book Media and Participation that participation is best thought about genealogically. So it's a kind of a value or problem that is articulated in different fields of theory and practice. He points to 5 in particular: democratic theory and practice, spatial planning, international development, arts and museums, and media and communication. Possibly the 2 main articulations in our case study emerge from spatial planning and media and communications. So on the one hand, the communicative infrastructures embodied by social media seem to kind of overlay, perhaps even exceed, the sort of intended, directed kinds of participatory exercises we might expect from a spatial planning or transportation scheme like Mini Holland. Facebook in particular seems to support what I would call a kind of ambient participation around urban transformation. So it's a kind of participation that doesn't really take the form of a discrete consultation exercise, but it's more a dispersed, everyday, often incidental kind of contribution. And I guess as far as the media and communication side is concerned, it's also the case that social media are often associated with what's sometimes called a participatory media culture. Now, this participatory media culture is sometimes celebrated, a la someone like Henry Jenkins, but it's also increasingly understood to present specific communicative problems for us. Like we see this increasingly, especially when people invoke the idea of a post-truth politics. So to conclude, why think about the relation of planning, platforms, and participation via the concept of field? Well, I think the first thing to say is it's important to underscore that we're using field here more so as a phenomenological concept rather than its traditional use as a sociological concept. So it provides us a way of thinking about communication infrastructures as appearing. In other words, to think about platforms or other types of participatory infrastructures, not so much in terms of the kinds of things they are, but more so in terms of what they do. Another way to think about this is to say that social media platforms provide us with certain environments for participation. Ones that involve both local enactments, but also a kind of translocal standardization, because these have very standardized architectures that are grafted onto various situations. And this translocal standardized side has very important implications. Benjamin Bratton suggests, for example, that platforms such as Facebook, Amazon, Google, they're more than economic entities. They are sort of cloud spaces that represent perhaps a new kind of political geography. They specifically maybe offer a new kind of, or enforce or impose a new kind of sovereignty, one that potentially transcends the local and the national. So what's ambiguous, I think, amongst many other things, are questions around who or what is responsible or accountable when these sorts of platforms become ordinary infrastructures of public communication. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for the invitation. To the organizers, I came yesterday as well, and for me as well. I mean, at least it's been very productive session yesterday and today. So, in my 15 minutes, what I would like to kindly provoke you, opening the floor for discussion about something that I've been working in the last 4 or 5 years, and is whether or not we are moving from the so-called hegemonic, technocratic, whatever you wanted to call, a smart city approach to another emergent concept that could be called experimental cities. So, and therefore we should, or we could ask, whether or not alternatives to the techno-deterministic approach to smart urbanism are flourishing. The point is that I would like to take this quote by the chair. Yes, you can laugh about this, because it's really related with something that I'm going to present afterwards, and I absolutely agree with this point in terms of the urban is not a science. Mainly because cannot be replicated. I'm going to just forget about the rest of the quote. I'm going to do a quite classic presentation. I'm going to be there are a lot of slides, so I'm going to be very quick, because I was preparing a key message, but then I need to do a framing paper, because I think that there are many layers on the key message. So. I'm going to start with the key message. I'm going to present the research hypothesis, that is whether or not are we moving on from a smart city to experimental cities, the rationale. I'm going to link a little with the first presentation about the metaphors, imaginaries, because I'm going to present 4 imaginaries about the smart cities. Then I'm going to discuss about this so-called concept from scratch, and then I'm going to start my path in my key concept, that is unplugging. I published an article that was unplugging, deconstructing the smart city in the Journal of Urban Technology, and I cannot start talking about the smart city without this beginning. That was for me the beginning, or at least is the way that I think about the smart cities. Then I'm going to add the layer of the data, of technopolitics of data, talking about the smart city it could be a spy city these days. And then I'm going to very, very briefly talk about 5 interventions that I've been involved in the last couple of years. And we conclude with a final remark. So the key message is that could be the smart cities from an artistic perspective. We know, I mean, according to De Jong and Josh and others in this paper, in this great paper, the evolution of the smart city has been awesome in the last years. And this is the evolution. This is a graph by Andrew Carbonen, so I have just picked it up from him. And I think that to some extent we are at the moment here in the critical, after the critical discourse. But for me, to be honest, for me as an academic, being critical is not enough. And maybe because I come from business, my background is I worked for more than 10 years in a cooperative business corporation that, I mean, apart from being critical, we should just implement real projects. So it's why sometimes I'm confused with the academic debates, being very critical all the time about the smart city and not going beyond. So I think that the starting point, I think Rob Kitchen is absolutely right, asking that we need to ask for 2 questions: for whom and what purpose are smart cities being developed, and the second one, what's the primary goal of the smart cities? I mean, markets, regulation, or even democracy, increasing democracy. But this is for me the key point. We didn't mention about gender and women, but I think that we need to put women in the right place. And Hannah Arendt, I think, he was very good just giving this citation, this quotation, when she said that the trouble with the modern theories of behaviorism is that they are not wrong, but they could become true. So I think we can apply this absolutely to the smart city at the moment. It's not it is true or it's not. The point is that it's becoming, to some extent true. So this is the hypothesis. Are we moving from the smart city to experimental cities? And is the chapter that I'm going to put after my talk in Twitter and open access that has been published in a book in Springer that is exactly exploring to what extent we are moving from the so-called smart cities. Getting out from the smart city in the box approach. So the research hypothesis, or this is the idea that I wanted to present today, is that maybe smartness might not be appealing, although the experimental approach has yet not been entirely established as a paradigm. And this is the main idea in which I'm working so far. So the rationale is I'm working in the practical field in a European Commission funded project that is called Replicate. It's why it's funny, I'm very critical with replication. I'm working a project that is Replicate, funded by the EU, and I'm the work package leader of replication. Could you imagine? So it's quite a paradoxical situation, running 6 cities. And at the same time, I've been coordinating the ESRC program, Urban Transformations from Oxford. So as I said, this is for me the starting point, the paper I'm plugging, the Constructing the Smart City. But then for example, I did something, I don't know, in a good or academically, in a good or a bad sense, writing with a practitioner in India that he worked in SAP, multinational. So I wrote a couple of chapters in this book about the smart city, trying to deconstruct what a practitioner could understand about the smart city. Then last year I published about something that yesterday was cited from the audience about the technopolitics of data in the journal system. And this is the last chapter that I mentioned. So I'm going to refer to this. So about the smart city, how can we really describe, at least in my opinion, the 4 imaginaries and from the practice? The first one, I think, is smart is mainly understood from the policymakers as modern times of Charles Chaplin, something that could be replicable, that could be based on very specific patterns that could be copy and pasted. This is the first imaginary. The second one is something that many people has mentioned, many speakers has mentioned yesterday and today, is the metaphor of efficiency. So it's why I think that we should revolve around the idea of Fritz Lang with the Metropolis, with the movie. The third one is something about promises, life expectancy. I could be reminded of Life Promise, Blade Runner movie by Ridley Scott. And the last one, I think, is when I saw this movie, we were just finishing the paper of Unplugging, and I was talking to the author, you know what, the next thing is going to be this. I mean, this is, I don't know if you are familiar with this movie, it's Her by Spike Jonze. Amazing, I really love that. Many people didn't like, but I did like. And I think that all the debate about data and algorithmic dreams or nightmares, I think that could be seen from these perspectives. So the point is that in the hegemonic idea of the smart city in the last years, everything has been focused on cities just building from scratch, like Masdar, that has been very deeply analyzed by scholars, Songdo in South Korea, the second so-called case. But there are some cases that they are not that familiar. Yesterday, Rob Cowley mentioned Wuhan. I was in Jinchuan in China 3 years ago, and I was absolutely surprised and shocked with the lack of the technopolitical awareness of the Chinese administration on that. I mean, nobody asked where this data comes from, and so on and so forth. And lastly, this year I had a chance to go to Kazakhstan, to the capital city, and I mean, the story, it's repeating itself once and another. I mean, many institutions funding a huge investment in technology in order to advocate the idea of the smart city. But yesterday, for a Scambler dinner, I talked with our Canadian friend about Toronto. The Sidewalk Labs is maybe the next kind of from scratch project. So yesterday, this citation was mentioned about Jürgen Habermas, when he said that smartness cannot be more technocratic than democratic, and it's why. As I mentioned, 3 years ago, we published the article Unplugging in the Journal of Urban Technology, and the idea was very simple. And we wanted to track, or at least suggest, 10 dimensions. And I think that so far, if I can read the 10 dimensions in questions, I think that they remain, because, for example, the who, we wanted to know, will the smart city evolve toward experimentalism into an urban sphere in which dealers have the right to decide whether to be connected? I think this question at the moment is there. Or the how, is the city a social interface in which the citizens will be able to self-design their social and everyday life needs? Or the system, for instance, will these devices serve citizens more than the citizens will serve the devices? I think we are exactly in this kind of debate at the moment. So I'm not going to go in detail because you have the paper, but with Unplugging, the first idea was not, I mean, we didn't want it to be provocative in terms of technophobic discourse. I mean, we need to unplug in a radical way. I mean, we wanted to suggest these two notions. And the first one, that's that being digitally connected or plugged in was not or is not guarantee of being smart. As simple as this. And the second one is why I added the second term, data. When Raymond Williams, in 1983, he suggested, Welsh anthropologist, he suggested technology is neutral, and it has the potential and the capacity to be used socially and politically for quite different purpose. So, because this is, going on at the moment. People absolutely into the bubble of hyper-connected societies. So it's why the idea of that we need already to deconstruct the smart city concept. The point is that how data is connected with this transition from the so-called hegemonic smart city to something that could be related to experimentalism. And I think that I should start quoting Harari when he recently mentioned that maybe we are already becoming tiny chips inside of giant systems that nobody really understands. Or, as he said, I mean, he's mentioning, and some other authors are already talking about dataism, the new religion on data. And that is why maybe we require a new approach based on multi-stakeholder approach, public scrutiny of data. And that's why I mentioned yesterday, I had a little intervention saying that maybe we need to advocate data ownership and also data commons, that there are two concepts that I'm working at the moment. And it's here, and against the backdrop of this context of the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, at least in Europe, where I think that maybe we are seeing a turning point. And say, maybe we are seeing a turning point. I'm saying that we are going to see. And why? And the idea is that maybe data sovereignty is becoming an increasingly important for data collocation, but also in terms of how some city authorities are claiming the digital rights of citizens. And I'm talking about Barcelona mainly, but also about Amsterdam. And mainly these are the two main research questions related to the technopolitics of data for me at the moment. And is that could cities and communities build a kind of alternative that would put citizens back in the driver's seat as decision makers rather than data providers? And the second question that is related is much more even experimental, is should cities and communities focus on building the decentralized infrastructure like blockchain? Someone yesterday slightly presented, and I think is the transition of this so-called hegemonic top-down technocratic smart city is just changing through, in my opinion, through these questions. Because the problem, as Eugene Morozov, is not the technological solutions themselves. The problem is who gets to implement them and what kinds of politics of reform do technological solutions smuggle through the back door. Because otherwise machines will make better choices than humans, and data could become like a detergent, like a commodity that it doesn't matter which kind of brand we are using. So we need a new deal, as Pendleton mentioned, Sandy Pendleton mentioned, we need a new deal, putting citizens back, so we need to consider data commons. So slightly, because I have 1.5 minutes, so I'm going to present slightly 5 projects that I've been involved, mainly in one in Europe, another one in the global south, and another one in the local regional perspective in the Basque Country in Spain. This is a replicate project that is, there are 6 cities involved. So mainly the research question is how can we promote methodological advancements that promote fruitful learning among cities, overcoming replicability. The Commission, the European Commission, is absolutely wrong with the perspective of how we could implement solutions from city to city, and it's why from Oxford we have suggested the following program that is called City to City Learning. We are organizing some workshops with different cities. I'm going to skip some of them because I wanted to be on time. We are running a survey, but there were some early findings, but I'm going to skip them because otherwise I don't have time enough. The second project is Smart Rural Communities, entirely in another kind of environment. This project has been funded by an NGO based in Madrid, Ayuda en Acción, and the point is that it has been quite cutting edge because we've been collaborating with cooperative firms in energy, ICT, and mobility. This is a fieldwork that we carried out last year in July in Colombia. This is why yesterday I was quite familiar with the presentation, but it was a remote post-conflict area in Bolívar, in Colombia. And that was in August last year in Mozambique, in Pemba. And the question was, is it possible to experiment with communities, not to communities, with communities, to reach the Sustainable Development Goals in the rural remote Global South to set up a new development model for international cooperation among NGOs. Cooperative firms is why I don't trust capitalist firms in this sense, but I can trust cooperative firms because I was working in there, and I think it's an entirely different philosophy to work among NGOs, academia, and the private sector. This is the third project that it was funded by the Marie Curie, and I compare Glasgow, Bristol, Bilbao, and Barcelona. Is why I was focusing on mainly in the last part in Barcelona. Mainly, how could we compare regionally rooted smart city strategies, the awareness and implication of the technopolitics of data, and as a consequence, the increasing claim for data devolution and technological sovereignty in the four cases. The conclusion of the four cases has been already published, as I mentioned before. This is another project that is called Smart Municipalities, that is based in the Basque country. And the research question is how can we experiment from the bottom up a cooperative city-to-city learning platform called Smart Municipalities among 232 municipalities in the Basque Autonomous Community, empowered with a high degree of fiscal devolution. And this is the last project that has been also published, that is how to experiment in a living lab in a very specific sector that is tourism, overcoming the tourismophobia effect in Spain, while empowering through local entrepreneurship. And that has been published in the Regional Science, Policy and Practice recently. So the final remark is, if smartness might not be appealing, and the experimental approach has yet to be entirely established as a paradigm, the point is that maybe we should start considering citizens from the decision-maker perspective more than the data providers. This is mainly the conceptual transitions that the chapter is describing in different kind of dimensions, in 10 dimensions. And this is the final remark. City, in brackets, smart, maybe it's just ecosystem of citizens rather than systems of algorithms, or the way they wanted to call. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. All their presentations were truly engaging. I have a question for the last speaker. I was wondering about, so one of the things about this kind of desire to reclaim the city and the question of whether people are kind of, empowered to actually give or plug out or plug in, wouldn't that require some kind of understanding of actually what data is, how it works? So in other words, I'm kind of wondering, how opaque this domain is, and how can we, claim rights as citizens to make informed decisions about when to plug in and out, when it's so difficult to understand what's happening and how it is happening.
So I had a question about time, just to perhaps to leave in, and maybe others could address it. I was wondering what a lot of us work on space, and much more recently. But what are the metaphors of time? Because you mentioned time, because that seems to be really significant in a lot of the things that time for segregation, time for leisure. I was wondering if you could reflect upon some of the metaphors of temporality that are being used throughout in the discourses that you're examining. Because that, again, time is historically within modernity and postmodernity has a very significant moment in terms of how people think about it. So what is it? I was wondering if, and others, because that seems to be something that I would really like to think about. Thanks.
Thanks. Really interesting presentations. I have one question for Levin, and this is actually very methodological because we are thinking about methodologies as we set out our new projects. And I just really found that idea of using metaphors as a kind of literary criticism tool into planning documents, and I was just thinking how we would use that in methodologies in which we're actually looking at examining smart cities or the rhetorics around smart cities. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how is that different from the conventional policy discourse analysis that social scientists are engaged in? Is it different, or is it similar, or are there connections between the two? What does literary critique bring on the table that policy discourse, conventional policy discourse, has not managed to bring in? And if I can squeeze in another question for Scott, a fascinating presentation, and I was just wondering again, these portals and these places where the participants are adding their data, how do they themselves, I mean, what is their engagement with that data? You spoke a little bit about how they put in their comments and all that sort of things, but what do they do with it afterwards when they put it into Facebook and it just gets static there? Is it kind of used or archived? Do they have control over the Facebook page? I mean, and maybe I'm just asking about ownership. I'm just literally thinking about what happens to all that stuff that participants are putting in. Do they even ask later on, what is happening to all the comments we made, and what are the ethics and what are the politics behind the afterlives of the data?
Take the last one from
I'd like to push all three speakers on this notion of subject formation under the smart regime. The lifestyle segregation that the first speaker spoke of, and how that is creating a new smarter citizen who can access these smart projects or smart cities. Even the second speaker spoke about a new kind of sovereignty, new forms of participation that are emerging. So, again, a form of subject formation where the smart city is creating a smart subject. And the last speaker very clearly attributed to the smart citizen and reclaiming the smart space from the citizen, by the citizen. And in all of these, just like the earlier project of governmentality, of the modern state coming in and automatically creating the civil and the political society in some senses, one also gets a sense that the next wave, the smart wave, will also leave out a large chunk in different ways. And even that reclaiming process will be just as tough as the earlier project of reclaiming, where we're still fighting the urban politics battle and still trying to make sure the urban life is for everyone in a sense, and now you're adding one more. So I'm just wondering, and I'm pushing all speakers here to see this through and to see where does this subject formation then move towards, and then what forms of biopolitical outcomes are we foreseeing with this when because especially I think Igor spoke of promises of replicability, efficiency, life promises, which are essentially totalizing forms of, efficiencies that are coming in, or, there's a shift, and we need to trace that. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to grab the mic again and add into what Sahil has said, and something I wanted to ask you, Scott, Igor, but I thought I wouldn't, but now I will, now that Sahil's put this up. There's a recent paper by Rob Kitchen and Paolo around smart citizenship and the using Sherry-Arnstein's ladder. And I'm just wondering if you could, following on from Sahil's question, if you could speak about how do you see that work moving into the kind of proposal they've made about the connection between governance and the formation of different typologies of smart citizenship.
responses?
Okay, I'm going to start answering Ursula. Maybe I have just skipped quickly because there were many slides, but it's something that, and I didn't even mention, but it's when you ask me how we could claim the rights of citizens, I think that is why I'm avoiding triple and quadruple helix. And it's something that I didn't develop, but it's part of one short paper in Regions magazine, that is pentahelix. And it's why the negotiation between the different entities, the different helixes, the private, the public, but not just the public and the private, not just academia and civic societies, is why I think something in between the four helixes is emerging. We can call bricolers, we can call assemblers, we can call entrepreneurs, we can call activists. So it's why I think that in some cases, mainly I'm researching at the moment, I'm answering right now to Iona the question about kitchen, and because they are working in Dublin, because they are based in Maynooth University. So I think that some cities are reorganizing the governance model or a structure to respond critically but constructively to the technopolitics of data, reorganizing stakeholders. Maybe it's something that I absolutely missed in my presentation because I thought that it was too obvious, but apparently it wasn't that obvious. So I think instead of talking about the social movements and the grassroots innovation and forgetting the public and the private, the so-called, I think that something is, we should merge. Let's say, I'm going to be very, very clear with my comment. We should merge the lefty ideology discourse with the conservative or, let's say, the liberal policy agenda. Because I think something just come up from there as a synthesis. It's at the moment, is what I I reach. And just answering to your question directly, building on this kind of pentahelix idea I think that they are, in Dublin, they are mapping how different stakeholders are contributing to the strategy of Dublin as a smart city. But so far, to be honest, in the literature, I cannot find any ambitious analysis, technopolitical analysis, how the really stakeholders are contributing or are negotiating in these processes. We have sometimes just the self-promotional examples of the private sector selling one city, and sometimes some initiatives from the public sector. But we have very little knowledge and very little academic knowledge on how some cities are bringing together different multi-stakeholders interplays. So it's why, personally, is what I am interested in.
Okay, so just to begin with Iona's question about what happens to this data and control, questions of politics of ownership, etc. I mean, that's one of the chief problems, obviously, because these are all three of them are third-party platforms, even the one used by the council, Commonplace. And there's terms and conditions that go along with each of them, and those terms and conditions create contractual parameters around the use of data. And also, each of these platforms have an API which controls access, etc. And so the short answer is that the users have very little control. There are ways in which they can gain control over their data. I mean, another way to answer it, I think, is in terms of our own research, we've had to think about these things in terms of you see, I was trying to anonymize the Facebook ones, because with the Facebook ones that we were using, those are private groups, and there are certain ways that that's structured on Facebook, and we have to think about research ethics as well. But I think that also overlaps into how a council, for example, might treat this data. So it's a very problematic situation that so much public discourse is happening through these platforms, and there's really open questions around how to contend with the politics that crop up from that. I want to answer the one on subject formation because I don't like ideas like smart subject and that sort of thing. And I think why I don't like it is because I think there's a tendency, and Gillian Rose picks up on this well, I think, in a piece in Annals of the Association of American Geographers, in a piece she wrote, there's a kind of a sense that when we're talking about technology, that we can kind of talk at it at a very general level and sort of think about, okay, here's a technology and here's the human or practices and the way in which we live in an algorithmic culture, and that this has equal implications across all different subject positions. And I think what's an interesting point that Gillian makes, which I think we need to pay a lot more attention to, is the ways in which actually, through technology, we have new ways in which subjects get formed, new ways in which subject positions get staked out. And certainly we found that in our research. It's not a flattening technology. In fact, it's a way, in some ways, that has accentuated forms of difference between people, or it's a place for people to articulate and either make claims or to just confirm ways of being in the world. And can I just say one thing on time? Because one of the things that I wanted to pick up on there is with what we're looking at, one of the things we found with these platforms is it's not just that this is a way in which people develop a spatial imaginary, but it's with social media, there's very much a sense of real-timeness, or like this is locality now. But one of the things that we also picked up is that it's not really real time. Like, I mean, you know, in all the smart city literature, there's a big emphasis on real time, especially with dashboards and that kind of thing. But actually, social media is fundamentally asynchronous. Like, I mean, you've got people adding contributions, and then you have those threads you saw, which, you know, involve this sort of stepwise sort of contribution. So there's a kind of interesting sorts of nowness that get created by platforms, and that's something that probably you could see manifest in lots of different ways across lots of different platforms.
Right, so we'll take 2 more quick and short questions.
I had an observation, and I found it very interesting that since yesterday, the idea of smart city as an endless experiment, or cities with different kind of definitions and labels coming in, are actually experimentation one after the other. And today, Igor talked about that probably smartness is not the idea that is so appealing or we should promote, but as the idea of experimentation itself. And extending it further to what Livian was saying, a lot of things that you presented from what are the ideas that are promoted about this particular smart city are very definite promises, right? But when you say experimentation, there is a certain amount of uncertainty about them. So the promise is of being sure about something, but experimentation is never sure about something in its very nature. And I was wondering, how do you both react to your ideas, one as a planner and one working through literary theory as a tool for planning? And I wanted to see your reaction to each other's ideas.
The last one.
Thank you. A very quick question for Levin. I just wondered what the response was to the segregation is good. Because we've had nothing quite that explicit here in London, but there has generally some kind of outcry. We do have poor doors and spiky architecture and this kind of thing, but nothing quite as in your face as segregation is good.
So I'll first answer quickly the segregation question. It's a case of one of these leaflets that it's there on the internet for everybody to see, but very few people react. The only reaction that I'm aware of is that I know an architect who was present at the symposium where this was presented, and there was also apparently a group of people at whom it was addressed, and these were people who would be potentially interested in buying these really expensive apartments and lofts, and they were really interested at this good segregation. And then this architect in question that I know then said that some of these afterwards said that, well, actually they had thought of buying, but then they realized that perhaps it wasn't as segregated as promised. And then they were a bit disappointed at that, and then they decided to stay in the suburbs nevertheless. But that's the only reaction that I received. So it's, I think, I guess at the background is still the idea of a Finland that thinks of itself as being very homogeneous, which it isn't, and the idea that segregation is something that simply doesn't exist, which obviously it does exist, and then that you can say these kind of things without feeling embarrassed or awkward at all, because it doesn't speak to you in a sense, in the same way that you can still use swastikas and symbols from 1930s nationalism just without feeling embarrassed, because it's just part of your natural history. The question about smart city, and then the question about definite promises and experimentation, and then I think it's so I've looked at the smart city actually mostly for what this metaphor tells me about all the other interesting conflicts of city visions it brings out. So I'm afraid I won't be able to say much, but I'm sure that you will be able to.
Well, I think it's a great question. Thank you. It's working. With this, I look like a rock star. I prefer to be an academic. So I think it's a really good question. But the point is that, I mean, linking a little bit your presentation of platforms, the point is that I think in Europe and in China, just to summarize, I think maybe the debate is not there, but in Europe at least, it's not an option to experiment. For me, it's a must at the moment for cities that, for example, I mentioned Barcelona because I'm researching about that, a little bit about Amsterdam, but the point is it's very simple. The effect of Airbnb as a capitalist platform or Uber in the city, for example, has provoked a very negative side effect about gentrification. It's not theory. I mean, it's something that is a fact. And that has provoked some kind of social movements, civic society, but at the same time, some reaction in the city authority. But at the same time, so it's why I think this is quite cyclic. At the same time, some private sector saying that, and in the city authority as well, reforming the procurement laws. So I think that the city is changing. Why? The digital rights are not something that is just ideology or politics. And it's why some cities are claiming for data commons. The data is not my data in my smartphone here today in the King's College is not owned by Facebook or in Twitter now when I'm going to do it. How can the city authorities provide some kind of cooperative platforms? Is why yesterday I asked you at dinner time, because the contrast of capitalist platform that are extracting our data is cooperative platforms. How to organize that at the city level? For me, this is my question, my research question. So it's why it's not a must, it's not an option. For me, it's compulsory. Unless you wanted to move onwards and not just stay with the so-called smart city and selling yourself. That's my position.
Any concluding remarks from the two of you? Okay, so we wrap it up for now, and surely we continue the discussions over lunch. Thank you very much to all the presenters.
Yeah.